care for each other. We do whatever it takes. But our world is on fire, and our future is at stake. We don't have time to wait, but no country, business, or individual can fix this on their own. Together, we can set things straight. Let's act. Through the power of many, we can make change happen. Let's encourage sustainable solutions. Let's suggest new ways of doing things and demand bad practices to stop. We all unite behind the one thing that matters: to save our world. Will you join us?
We are in a climate emergency, and we are very far from where we need to be.
Welcome to the second Exponential Climate Action Summit.
This decade is crucial for the future of us all.
The outcomes for humanity could actually spell disaster.
There are no jobs on a dead planet.
And that's why waiting is not an option.
We're not recovering in a green way as we had hoped last Earth Day.
Poor communities are the one really facing the biggest burden of climate effects.
World Bank estimates that every year we need $4 trillion of capital in emerging and developing economies to pay for the mitigation and adaptation needs.
Personally, I don't believe the fossil fuel industry should continue to be allowed to operate the way it's been operating for the last several decades.
The vast majority of green products on the market today create new profits for investment firms, but do absolutely nothing to fight climate change.
We have to transform the 55% greenhouse gas reduction target that we now have at the European level, the declaration that we're getting from other countries, including Biden today, to halve their emissions, into actions.
So we need strong climate action from business, we need strong climate action from finance. I will encourage every company, every financial institution to join the race to zero immediately.
Investing in a low-carbon, a resilient economy is actually an enormous opportunity right now.
The winners will be the ones creating positive impact.
And what we do at Karin is we offer investment options in solar energy projects in emerging markets.
So fintech is helping resolve access issues for the financial excluded while addressing climate change issues at the same time.
The key here is to put at least the same amount of determination behind actions to achieving this target as we do for major financial or business targets that the companies typically steered on.
So we don't have time, but we do have solutions.
When you scale this solution, in fact, we will save money. We will increase our productivity.
It's a $100 trillion plus economy, the greatest opportunities ever.
That is how we change things together. Your opinions will also be a rating on our platform, where those business and organizations that are doing good climate action will get a better climate score compared to the ones not doing enough. This is going to change how corporations compete.
This top line is 200 to 300 green growth companies that are delivering much better results while taking down our footprints.
Young people have demonstrated that campaigns on the ground can actively shape where the money goes.
We want to be the one, the provider, that shows to the company, its employees, that you can make a change with your savings.
We now got 87 asset managers with $37 trillion of assets. That's more than a third of global assets committed to net zero by 2050, and 43 banks with $29 trillion.
The drive to net zero is the growth story of the 21st century.
And the time to act is now.
And about 73% globally of all used clothing is being incinerated or landfilled today.
Our food systems are failing massively, both people and planet.
In 40, 50 years, the glass age will sort of be over because we don't have any sand left to produce glass.
So ultimately, over 90% of all that hard-won stuff we use slips through our fingers and ends up as waste.
Welcome to the third Exponential Climate Action Summit broadcast.
Create a sustainable future by transitioning to a society based on circular principles.
We use 95% less water than traditional farming.
Reusing products has given us a revenue growth of, on average, 20% per year.
So we decided to design for circularity and eliminate the concept of waste.
We want to create a climate neutral car by 2030.
It's removing 1.54 kilos of carbon per bottle.
You have to understand the life cycle impact to know if it's better to use and reuse or if it's better to recycle and use the material another time.
The problem, though, is that the nitrogen that we produce are we not allowed to use today. Because today's legislation, if you're going to use something, it depends on origin and not the quality. And if it has been waste, it is banned.
What governments should do is to ban like landfill possibilities.
Today, reused materials very often are more expensive than virgin materials.
Cars have now absorbed almost all the space in cities, all the rights of way, all the parking space.
We can't wait for 2025, 2030. We need to change now.
Digitalization is one of the great opportunities to actually transform the world as we know it right now.
We need to have a behavioral change and mindset, not only in the companies, but also in the consumers and in the governments.
What if we could change the system together? We believe by rewarding climate solutions and warning all the polluters, we will make it profitable to save our planet and super expensive to destroy it.
The circular economy is gaining traction around the world.
We are working on a system of laws and improvements to the system so that you can fix everything.
More than 2/3 of the world economy are covered now by net zero targets.
The initiative is really about bringing together the leading companies that will transform, disrupt, and innovate our way along that pathway.
We are ready to make this transformation the greatest collab in human history.
The future is in our hands.
So what will this require then for us to achieve in Glasgow? But this must be the moment when we say goodbye to yesterday's provision of energy.
We are going to be there by train, of course, and we're going to do daily broadcast in 2 weeks.
We are, of course, really happy to team up with We Don't Have Time during COP26.
We're there really to drive up numbers.
COP26, of course, is critical.
I think the most important thing will be for all member states to understand that the material use should be a priority in their climate policies.
And we will be there and shine a light on what's happening.
For many years, we thought that the oil, coal, and gas, the fossil fuel industry, the transport, the telco industry, that was the biggest cause of human suffering and greenhouse gas emissions. Absolutely not. The biggest industry that touches every human being on Earth, human suffering, human health, and greenhouse gas emissions is the agriculture, seafood, and beverage industries and how we produce and consume food. And so it's the biggest pivotal moonshot moment in history that we have. 9 years left to really fix it. And so I say global food reformist. I think the entire food system needs to be reformed.
For every 2 tons of food produced on the planet, 1 ton is wasted. So around 1/3 of everything that's produced on the planet is wasted. It's over 1 billion tons of food every single year. Now, when you talk about those big statistics, It's hard to get your head around them. So let's just talk about them in a bit different way. You need an area the size of China to grow the food that we throw away every single year.
I think like all these like purpose-driven companies has to help their consumers to find the aha moments, because we are not enough as perfect consumers. We have to become active citizens as we are running out of time and have to act so extremely fast within this.
Restoring nature is so low-tech, and in a time where everything has to be high-tech and complicated, I believe people are in dire need of solutions. So yes, I do believe that consumer-facing communication, whether it comes from brands or from NGOs like ourselves or from governments, is super important when it comes to really changing the mindset and really making this the decade of doing.
It was a great meeting, but the highlight of it is that Jeff Bezos, who was at the meeting, made a big announcement to invest $1 billion for landscape restoration in Africa. I think we need that magnitude of funding. So Jeff Bezos' commitment will come together with another commitment made by 8 financial institutions. So in total now we have $20 billion committed for land restoration in the Sahel from 2021 to 2025.
When we look at what the dietary people say, the specialists, they're looking at the nutrients of this kind of food and they see it's great. You know, it's basically beans in different varieties that you have refined. So you will have a high protein content, you will get a lot of nutrients in it, so we know beans are good for health. Mm-hmm. And then we can argue about, could we produce those kind of foods in a better way? Of course we can, and we will. So I think moving away from as a society, moving away from some of the large-scale farming, monocrops, to more regenerative farming, that's what we're going to see.
What can we do as citizens and consumers? Well, firstly, it's about shifting our consumption to start to halve down our own emissions, like moving to plant-based food, reduce food waste, and becoming more circular in our consumption, of course.
Our ask of the policymakers is regulate.
Morning.
Yep, that's right.
My name is Charlotte
company is
Clymer.
saying
My pronouns are she, her.
But we
and
need
I want to
it.
welcome
My
you
God,
all
do we need it.
to day 10
We have
and
got
the
to
final
set
day
global
of the
standards for
2022
carbon accounting
United
and carbon
Nations Climate
offsetting.
Change Conference.
Right now, it's
also
a
known as
wild
the Conference
west
of
out
the
there.
Parties of the United
There's
Nations
lack of clarity, and
Framework
it just
Convention
feeds,
on Climate Change,
greenwashing and
COP27.
delays meaningful.
For the past 9 days, the Climate Change and Justice Organization, We Don't Have Time, the world's largest social media for the climate, and the organization that launched Greta Thunberg to fame, has hosted conversations with a stage inside the diplomatic zone in Egypt, and in local hubs in Nairobi, Kenya, Stockholm, Sweden, and finally today in Washington, D.C. Our final day of conversations carries the theme, Forward Together, how to ensure the climate transition is just and equitable, in partnership with American University's School of International Service and the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, who are so generously hosting us in person on their main campus here today in DC. Today we will hear from extraordinary individuals on the importance of climate justice and what we can all do to be part of the solution to save this planet we all love, while centering the needs of the most marginalized communities in our world, who will bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change if our world leaders fail to do what needs to be done. Today's speakers include Karin Olofsdotter, Ambassador of Sweden to the United States, Wendall K. Jones, Ambassador of the Bahamas to the United States, Tanya Clayhouse, Executive Vice President for Campaigns and Advocacy at the Hip Hop Caucus, Shannon Hayter, Dean of the American University School of International Service, Simon Nicholson, Director of the American University's Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, and many more leaders who will enlighten and motivate us all on the path forward to ensuring no one is left behind in the fight for climate justice. Nearly 50 years ago, President John F. Kennedy delivered one of his most memorable speeches right here at American University, which included this stirring observation on how humanity is bound together. He said, quote, "If we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal." And President Kennedy was right. And in the decades since that iconic address, we have come to have a more nuanced understanding of what it means to live in a world being ravaged by forces seemingly insurmountable. We may all face serious consequences from climate change, that is true, but we do not all face the same consequences. The most vulnerable populations, the hardest hit when hurricanes or floods or droughts strike, are those who bear little responsibility for climate change. So, we are here today to learn about what it means to pursue climate justice within a framework that does three things. Number one, recognizes that key groups are differently affected by climate change. Two, acknowledges how climate impacts can exacerbate inequitable social conditions. And three, creates momentum for building climate justice solutions. Moreover, we are here because of the pioneering labor by activists from the global south in response to the threats facing their homelands. The concept of climate justice that is now so commonly used by researchers, NGOs, and politicians all over the world began with the work of those activists, and we are grateful for their labor. I realize this is an intimidating topic. I believe that to most people, climate change feels vast and overwhelming, almost impenetrable to understanding or solutions. And because of that intimidation, because of that fear, the average person may be reluctant to engage on this issue, perhaps for fear of what they may learn. I will admit to you all that I have felt that fear in the past. So have many others in this space. And what has propelled us in our motivation to pursue climate justice is the confidence that comes with understanding the whole scope of the problem, having faith in each other to build a movement that works toward solutions, and shining light of knowledge where the darkness of ignorance remains. Only through collaboration of learning and advocacy like this will we find our way toward a future that leaves no one behind and builds a world that we may all hope to leave our children someday. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and we can't wait to get started. And with that, it is my great honor to introduce the chair of the U.S. Advisory Board for We Don't Have Time, Thomas Snitch. Tom has been in D.C. for almost 48 years. He has served in 3 branches of the U.S. government. He was the first person to fly a drone in Africa and captured rhino poachers. And he spent several years at the Fukushima reactor plant. He will be cooking Thanksgiving dinner for a group of AUSIS students, and he has told us that the menu is available upon request, but no substitutions. Folks, please welcome Thomas Snitch.
Well, good morning, and unfortunately the table is full. We have the students from Retsumeikan, Japan, who are here coming for Thanksgiving dinner, so it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. If you ever spent Thanksgiving in Japan, the word turkey in Japanese is shishimencho, which means the 7-color bird. And to show cultural differences, in Japan, they hate the smell of cooking turkey. They think it's a very off smell, so call me Friday and we'll see how next Thursday works out. I'm very honored to be here today because this is my home. I did my master's here, I did my doctorate here, and I spent 5 years on the faculty here. And in retrospect now, as an older person, it was probably the best 8 years of my life at this place. So I'm so happy to be back in SIS. I came here from Cleveland, Ohio. I went to school in Ohio, and I moved here for graduate school. And my commitment to the environment and environmental justice began on June 22nd, 1969. Does anybody know why that date's important? It's not on the test, so it's the day the Cuyahoga River caught fire. I was living in Cleveland. I was in high school, certainly not the valedictorian by any means, but it seemed rather something was inherently wrong. The river was on fire, and it burned up a bridge. Not burned down a bridge, the bridge burned up from the bottom up. And I'll never forget they had the news that night of the fireboats coming in from Lake Erie, which Lake Erie in the 1960s was another story. And as they sprayed water on the fire, it looked like you were taking lighter fluid and spraying it on your barbecue. The flames were just flying off the river, setting everything off on fire. And you wondered, what in the world is going on here? The river is on fire. Well, 10 months later, we have the first Earth Day, and everyone in our class had to read Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book. And we thought if we just stop with the DDT, the birds will come back, and we have plenty of time. Well, sitting up here today, I say that might have been an overly optimistic view. The time is running short. I'm not saying we don't have time, but it's time for some action and doing things. And that's why I'm very happy to see you here today. Before I introduce the Dean, I'd like to just give you some things to think about during today's talk. It's sort of 3 rules of life that I've learned in studying environmental issues for almost 50 years in Washington. And they're quite simple, frankly. Number 1, never forget the law of unintended consequences. That's not to say that the outcomes are wrong, but I've learned many times it's the inputs are wrong. The assumptions of the model aren't correct. And if you don't get the assumptions right, your outcomes will be wrong by definition. So, what could go wrong with cryptocurrency? Fracking. Wow, great idea. The oil's there. All we have to do is figure a way to squeeze it out. Nothing bad's going to happen. The war in Ukraine. Never forget the law of unintended consequences, because that's the thing that will come back and get you. The second one of Tom's rules of the environment is, I love mysteries. And I would encourage you to read the story of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes book about the dog that didn't bark. It's the curious story of the dog at night where a horse was stolen, blazed silver, and there was a murder committed. And in the courtroom, they found out there was a dog sitting there, and the dog never barked. And Sherlock Holmes said, well, isn't that the most curious thing? Why did the dog didn't bark? Why the dog didn't bark? Well, the dog didn't bark because he knew who the thief and the murderer was. It was his master. In life, watch for the dog that doesn't bark. 3 years ago today, the COVID dog was not barking in China. Now, 3 years from next March, the dog was howling, but he was howling here. I've learned after working on a lot of places in Washington, the dog that doesn't bark is the sneaky one that'll come back and bite you. So keep an eye on that. And finally, probably the most important thing I've learned in the past 50 years of studying the environment, Mother Nature always wins. She always wins. The best you can hope for is a temporary tie. Birds and airplanes are good examples of ties. As long as the bird's flapping its wings, as long as the aircraft has fuel and it has forward motion to create lift, you can defeat gravity temporarily. When the bird gets tired, when you run out of jet fuel, gravity wins. Because Mother Nature always wins. I look at Mother Nature as the embodiment or the personification of the laws of physics. Physics rule. And if you keep those ideas in mind, when you're developing models and solutions, you won't run into problem number 1, unintended consequences, or at least you'll figure ways to mitigate that. And 2, you'll have a pretty good idea where that sneaky dog is sitting, quietly waiting for you to make a mistake. So, unintended consequences, quiet dogs, and there was an old commercial, and I don't remember what it was for, but the tagline was, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. It's not. And she'll come back and get you. So with those cheery words, let me introduce our dean. I met Dean Hayter her second day on the job. We had lunch together, and one of the first things I did was say, hey, Dean, I work with this group. We don't have time. That SIS building looks pretty nice. Do you think we could use it for something? She didn't hesitate for 1 second. She said, yes, absolutely. I said, could we make AUSIS sort of the Washington academic home of we don't have time? Yes. And so I'm very happy to introduce the dean because she comes to us from a very different place. She's not an academic, she's a medical doctor who spent a lot of her life in very bad places, working on very tough issues with very sick people. She's not an academic, she knows how to get stuff done. And I think that's what the school needs. That's what all of us who are going in these fields like you need to know. How do you address hard problems and find solutions? So with that, let me introduce our brand new dean, Dean Shannon Hayter.
Wow, good morning, everybody. And that's a good morning to everybody abroad as well. So hopefully a lot of people are tuning in to be with us today. It is our pleasure here at AU School of International Service to be one of the hot spots for this worldwide hub on climate justice, to line up with the COP27 work. And so my job here is pretty simple, is to welcome you all. Welcome everybody who's in the room, everybody who's going to be stopping through doing our 3-hour block, all of our illustrious panelists and contributors, and all the folks that are tuning in from around the world. Tom mentioned it seemed like a no-brainer to immediately say, of course we'd love to partner, of course we'd love to host this. But why is that? You know, not just that it's a big issue, right? But I think there's elements about how we come together to respond, how we develop solutions for climate justice that are just so part of the DNA of the School of International Service. It resonates with who we are, with what we do, and with how we engage the world here. Who we are. You'll notice our name, School of International Service, not just the School of International Studies. That is a distinction that matters to us. It's something real. We're founded on a mission to wage peace, founded during the Cold War, and with a definition that said, you know, waging peace is not just about a lack of war. It is about going out there and driving solutions that will positively impact humanity. So for this topic, can't imagine a better resonance with who we are as SIS. Second, what are we actually doing across our faculty, across our students, across our alumni? On climate, we have faculty working on so many areas of climate and environmental justice, everything from the effects of climate-induced migration, the nexus between climate and agriculture, climate impacts of trade on the needs of communities as remote as Bangalore and as close as some of the communities here in the United States. Opportunities and challenges associated with removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and how to build peace through environmental action. You'll hear from a number of our folks as we go through the day, including Dr. Simon Nicholson, who has founded and is now running our AU-wide Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, which is going to pull together action from across all of our schools at AU to really build a way forward. And then finally, you know, how we engage the world from SIS is also why this partnership with We Don't Have Time matters so much. We have a real dedication to that continuum between scholarship and practice. What does that mean? We care about action. We care about action. We care that the biggest thinkers and doers are frankly the same people, but we come together and we bring people together so that our cutting edge ideas inform cutting edge practice, and then we get more cutting edge ideas and drive forward to action. And so I am thrilled to be here with you all today. I'm very excited about what we're going to learn and hear about today, and I'm really excited about what comes after today for all of us. I love how Charlotte framed some of the missions for this week on climate justice, to recognize the unequal impacts of climate trauma, to recognize how those unequal impacts widen inequalities, they don't narrow them, and to recognize we have to create momentum for the solutions and the investments for those solutions that it's going to take to change things. Now, Tom mentioned I come from a bit of a health background, and I have to say all of those factors demonstrating inequalities in impact, exacerbating social and economic inequalities that are already there, and rights inequalities that are already there, needing momentum for solutions. Those are all things that were laid bare in our recent COVID pandemic as well. And you know what? We didn't do so well at meeting the need on those factors. So I think highlighting that only because we haven't as a world gotten those things right yet. But now is the time. Now is the time. We don't have time to wait. And I'm just thrilled that you're all here to help us build momentum for those solutions. So with that, I think I get to welcome Charlotte back to take on the program.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Dean Hayter. Please give them another hand. That was absolutely wonderful. Now, I have the distinct pleasure for our next segment of introducing our moderator, Sarah Jackson Hahn. She's the Senior Advisor for Communications and Partnerships and Policy at the UNDP. She has more than 20 years of media experience working with everything from print and broadcast to speech and op-ed writing. She held roles as Senior Communications Officer at the World Bank Group, Asian Affairs Editor and Correspondent with Agent France Presse, Communications Director with Radio Free Asia, and Online Editor with National Public Radio. Folks, please welcome Sarah Jackson Hahn. I'm excited for this.
Should we have our panelists come up as well?
Oh, please, yes, please, please. I assumed you were going to introduce them, but.
Oh, okay. Here we go. We have Ambassador Olofsdotter of Sweden.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you as well. Ambassador Jones of the Bahamas. Hey, nice to meet you. Please have a seat. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean Hayter. Thank you, SIS. Thank you. We don't have time. And thanks so much to all of you for being here for this very important conversation as we wrap up COP27 in Egypt. It's such a pleasure to meet you both. We thought maybe we'd start with a lightning round. What are your top takeaways? What are Sweden's top takeaways from COP27? Did it meet your expectations?
Well, hard to say yet, of course. We have a new government in Sweden that is forming our new climate policy. So we're in a kind of transformative phase in my country. But of course, we all realize how urgent this is, and we see the things happening around the world. We see the weather, just the weather, and even in Sweden, how warm it has been. And the effects it has. So for us, it's very much about how do we combine treating, climate change, helping, doing what we can, with also creating new economies and new jobs and growth out of that. And I think we are on a good path. We also chaired something that we formed together with India quite a few years ago now called Lead It, where it's, I think, 30 plus actors, including governments and also heavy emission industries. So that was a very important part for us because we think that we really need to get the industries and the business sector to drive change because if we don't focus on them, that's where the emissions are. So this was really important for us.
Good. And how about you? What are your takeaways? What are your government's takeaways from COP27?
Our government was very pleased to participate in COP27, but we in the Caribbean, we are still waiting for real action by the developed countries of the world. Our Prime Minister has made the point that we are out of time. Promises and agreements are easy, but action requires courage. And as they left Egypt, the international community was still working on a set of rules to deal with the problem that we are faced with. We are victims of climate injustice in the Bahamas and in the Caribbean. The Bahamas sits really in the middle of the world. We say that it is better in the Bahamas because of our climate, because of the pristine waters that we have, but we believe that our nation is being polluted by the industrialized countries of the world, the developed countries. In terms of carbon emission, we emit 0.01%. 0.01%. And so we are victims. And we have had ferocious hurricanes over the last 2 decades in particular that have devastated many islands of the Bahamas. We are still recovering from Hurricane Dorian, which destroyed many homes, many businesses. It wrought some $3.4 billion in damage in the Abacos and Grand Bahama. Our hospital in Grand Bahama is in bad shape, and many areas are inoperable. The airport is still closed after 2019, simply because we have seen these calamities that have developed, and we are living in Hurricane Alley of the world. We are still calling on the world to put their money where their mouth is. Over the last several years, $100 billion was promised to come to the aid of developing countries, small developing countries like the Bahamas. So far, in terms of mitigation, only $2 billion has been realized or been donated. And so the developed countries, the industrialized countries, are very delinquent in coming up with solutions to the problems and to bring aid and comfort to those small island developing states like the Bahamas that are adversely affected.
You're touching on so many issues related to climate justice, which is a phrase that we're hearing more and more and more these days. But inequality and leaving no one behind are also phrases that we use a lot in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to ask you, Ambassador Olofsdotter, in terms of leaving no one behind, what are some of the steps that Sweden has been taking to make sure that...
Well, this summer, actually, we had the 50-year anniversary conference of the UN conference on the human environment in Stockholm. And we used that one to try to accelerate the transformation that then would lead to sustainable and green economies. So that's one contribution. We have also, for many, many years have very generous development aid, 1% of GDP. Now we're cutting it a little bit because we need to also focus on Ukraine and so on. But that goes down to 0.8. So it's still very high numbers for my country that we will also focus in this area. We are really looking at, in my country, because we are all challenged, of course, when more extreme, of course, from in Bahamas than in my country. But we try to look at this through, as I say, almost an industrial revolution kind of perspective. And the far north of Sweden has been very hurt by globalization, jobs have moved and so on. But now we see it booming because of the energy resources we have there, which are natural resources, it's water. We can now build, sustainable battery factories. We are doing green kind of mining. We are looking for the minerals that we are needed to build the electrical vehicles and so on. So there's a huge transformation in my country where also you see a region that has really been in a very sad state, booming with jobs. And then we, of course, have to build the infrastructure, schools and everything. So it's kind of a good example of how regions that have been hurt can also be transformed through the technology that we need to try to really help all of us, but particularly vulnerable countries like yours.
Absolutely. And Ambassador Jones, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more. You described some of the wreckage as a result of Hurricane Dorian, and I realized that the Bahamas is really at the epicenter of a lot of bad trends related to climate change. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what the Bahamas is doing in the way of adaptation, mitigation. And I must admit, I didn't realize that the airport was still closed 3 years later.
Well, the airport is not really closed, but sections of it is closed, and we are seeking funds to restore the airport to what it used to be. The national debt of the Bahamas, half of it is caused by hurricanes that have passed through the Bahamas. Every time there's a major hurricane, it leaves billions of dollars of damage, and the government then is forced to cover the deficits or to seek loans to restore infrastructure, bridges, roads, schools, hospitals, airports, that type of thing. And so our national debt would probably be half of what it is had it not been for these ferocious hurricanes. But in terms of mitigation, and this has to do with reducing greenhouse emissions into the system. The Bahamas is committed to a 30% introduction of renewable energy to our electricity grid by 2033. The Bahamas is transitioning to electric vehicles in the fleet of in government vehicles. We want 15% of all vehicles on our streets to be electric by 2030. The Bahamas is declaring 20% of our forests as forest reserves. We are rehabilitating our mangrove ecosystems. We are working with the hotel industry in the Bahamas to have all of our hotels equipped with green cooling systems. So they are doing a whole lot in terms of mitigation. With respect to adaptation, which has to do with things like early warning systems, erosion of coastlines, coral bleaching, the delivery of clean, potable water, access to food, among other things. We are doing quite a lot in this regard. Today we find that many of the developing countries, as I mentioned, are pulling back on their commitments to assist developing countries like the Bahamas. These developed countries are pulling back. And so currently we find ourselves having to fund all of the initiatives that these calamities have wrought in the Bahamas. I mentioned out of the $100 billion pledged by COP21, only $12 billion has been produced, $10 billion to mitigation projects, and $2 billion has been donated to adaptation. And so countries like the Bahamas have to fund ourselves out of these situations. We have to finance mitigation as well as adaptation. And so we are always looking for ways to ameliorate the situation. I spoke with a public servant in Nassau, the Bahamas, yesterday, and she said to me, you know, in terms of what we are doing, I am now driving an electric vehicle. that has been provided by the government of the Bahamas. And as I mentioned, we are changing the entire fleet of government vehicles by 2033.
I'm glad you mentioned the issue of debt. It's an enormous and crushing problem, and the head of the IMF, the president of the World Bank, and our own administrator have advocated vigorously and publicly on the issue of debt and the burden that so many countries are now facing. You know, I think of Sweden. I think most people think of Sweden as having a fairly progressive private sector, and I've been impressed personally by what I've seen coming out of Sweden, including in the financial sector. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the private sector's work.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I think that's a very, as I also touched upon earlier, it's crucial that the private sector is seeing this as market opportunity, and they really are in Sweden. So we have, I mean, it's really key to change, and Sweden is actually the third most innovative country in the world, and that's of course our business sector that is really driving that as well. So we see in Sweden that the consumers, they want to buy or consume climate friendly, even when it comes to, as you said, the finance sector. When you borrow to buy a house, you want to, you know, borrow from a bank that has green financing. We're also seeing now some banks going into blue financing. So this is, I think, an area that's really interesting. And what we have, I think, is a very interesting project called Fossil Free Sweden, where 22 different business sectors voluntarily has made roadmaps on how to, at different time frames, become fossil free or net zero emitters. So you have the cement industry, which is crucial. If we can break, you know, that industry into being net zero emitters, that would be amazing, because they stand for a lot. We have the steel sector. We have the first produced carbon-free steel in the world, which is huge. And of course, all the car industries want to buy this steel because that also lessens the emissions from the car industry. So what's interesting is that it's industry-driven, which makes, you know, change happen. And I think about 400 Swedish companies have signed up for that. And as Sweden is such a, our industry is so global, you know, 45 or 50% of our GDP comes from trade with others. And for instance, in the United States, we're the 13th largest investor. So those companies, those big multinational Swedish companies, they take their innovations with them, of course, when they invest abroad. So this, you know, it spreads. And I really think that for consumers also in the United States, this is something that's very important, and that's how we can also drive change.
Absolutely. Well, given that Sweden is such a tiny emitter of carbon, does it actually matter if Sweden gets to net zero?
Absolutely. We're the size of California, land-wise. We're huge. And also, as I said, no one is an island here, if I may say so. We must all do this together. So if we can lead by example, if we can find innovations that, you know, cut emissions that in the end will help you and help all of us, it's super important. So size in this way doesn't matter. It's really what you can do. And given that we are such a highly industrialized country, I think also we have certain big responsibilities to really do this change.
You know, there's so many different overlapping crises going on in the world right now. We're still recovering from pandemic. And as Dean Hayter said, we certainly didn't distinguish ourselves as a species in how we dealt with it. We've got that, we've got climate change, we've got crises erupting all over the world. Millions and millions of people have been displaced by climate emergencies and by conflict. UNDP produces a flagship report every year called the Human Development Report, and it's always been one of my favorite reports. And this last edition that came out in September was really quite remarkable. And my colleagues sort of dove into the data, and they looked at all the different crises erupting all over the world and found that with rising tribalism, with distrust, with misinformation, disinformation, people are just feeling insecure. They don't trust each other. Because they don't trust each other or their governments, we're not really able to come together and take the collective action we need to take to solve problems like crises and climate. And, there are various takeaways from that. There are recommendations, and I would heartily recommend that report to everybody in this room and beyond. But I have to ask, from where you sit, what's the call to action for ordinary citizens, for governments, for civil society? What steps do we need to take to really move forward and move the needle?
We need the international community to be proactive and to do what is required. And I think there is a reticence on the part of many developed countries not to come to terms with the problem. We have been doing a whole lot of talking, and the action is not commensurate with the amount of talking that is going on. As I mentioned, the international community in Egypt was left to find a solution to the problem, to come up with a framework to govern carbon credits, and this is perhaps was one of the main items on the agenda in Egypt. What we need now is an equitable framework put together by the international community. We in the Bahamas have already put in place national laws, and we are awaiting the international laws so that we can trade in carbon credits, for instance. It should be noted that the Bahamas submitted its nationally determined contribution to climate change under the Paris Agreement. Every country pledged to update its contribution every 5 years. And so far there have been many countries that have not complied, have not updated their pledges. And so we are ready in terms of laws, and we have millions of carbon credits that we are able to trade. We have mapped out the seabed bed of the Bahamas, and we are waiting for the international community and huge companies in these industrialized nations of the world to take advantage of the carbon credits that we have available.
And you, from your perspective, what is the call to action? What do we need to do to really turn
I
this
think
around?
first of all, we really need to work together. So, it's that the world leaders can gather like they have done at COP27 is of course extremely important, and that also that civil society puts pressure on our leaders. And in most of our countries, we have elections, so we must take our vote very seriously. And also, of course, climate change is very big part of the political choices we make. So we as individuals have that responsibility to use our democratic rights to, when that is possible, to vote. So we must work together multilaterally. We must work together with, as I've been speaking to, with academia and the business community, because we really must drive innovation, and we must be able to scale innovation, I think, in a more rapid way than we have been able to do. And as Ambassador said, that the public sector in the Bahamas is changing to electrical vehicles. That's an important sign. So things like that actually do matter, and I think we also need to see what we can do in our own lives. For instance, in Sweden, waste management is a huge thing. We only put 1% of our garbage into landfills. The rest is actually used to make energy or in production and so on. And we have fantastic technology for that. So when we build new, for instance, housing areas in Sweden, it becomes like a zero-sum energy area where the waste goes into the making the energy for that whole area of housing, for instance. So there are a lot of things coming. I think it's a matter of, Ambassador also rightly pointed out, financing and make it faster. So there are a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you touched on innovation. It's just so critical. I listened to an interview the other day with Bill McKibben, and he was surprisingly upbeat. He takes the view that we're now at an inflection point. For 700,000 years, humans have been burning things, and it's destroying the planet. But now the technology exists, the prices have come down.
And if I can just add, I mean, my country has proven that we can cut emissions by quite a lot. So the last 30 years, we've cut our emissions by 30%, but we've grown our economy by around 80%. So, you know, the ones who say that you can't grow your economy while you cut emission, that's not true, because of course new jobs are created in new industries and so on. So this is, I think, extremely important message.
Absolutely. My colleagues have done some really interesting work on something called SDG Impact. They put together investor maps to find, you know, these opportunities where there's a convergence between, you know, doing things that are climate friendly and doing things that are profitable. So I think it's an important thing to keep in mind always. So I guess I just want to know, bottom line, are you optimistic that we can turn this around?
I'm not as optimistic as I think I should be. Given the fact that we see from Egypt that the developed countries are pulling back on their commitments to assist developing countries like the Bahamas to address climate change. You would have heard of the commitments made from COP21. We are now at COP27, and they have not been forthcoming in keeping their commitments. And many countries, as I mentioned, have not fulfilled their pledges to update the international community on what they are doing in their respective countries to deal with climate change and to ameliorate the situation. I'm happy to hear what is happening in Sweden. And so while they take their slow time, or they are not doing anything, or inactive, we have developing countries like the Bahamas and Barbados and all of these other countries that are languishing, that are suffering. Our Prime Minister has been taking a leading role along with the Prime Minister of Barbados in bringing this matter to the attention of the world. And you're going to have a serious migration problem in the world, because people are going to leave these developing countries and they're going to find their way in Sweden and other countries in Europe, in the United States, because their way of life is changing. Our fishermen, they have to go farther afield for fish, and they are losing their homes because of hurricanes. And so, if people are losing their farms and fishermen are not able to fish the waters as they used to, they are going to look to other countries of the world for refuge. All right, and so there is a need for the international community to move faster, and we are out of time.
No, I guess I should also be more optimistic when you see the kind of innovations we can muster and all that. But at the same time, we are in a time right now where we have huge geopolitical security tensions. And for instance, just in Europe, we have to focus on the war in Ukraine, and then hopefully one day when the war is over, we have to focus on the rebuilding of Ukraine. And we see the great power game between, big parts of the world. And I worry that this also will overshadow the important work on climate change, because there are other, like warlike or security tensions around the world, which is, of course, very, very serious. So right now, I'm not very optimistic, but I really hope that through the things we've talked about, we can change. We have to change, because as was said earlier, this is our only planet. We have to take care of her, otherwise she will take care of us.
Yeah, we have to talk about the urgency of now, And while we empathize with the people in Ukraine, and our country, the Bahamas, is in full support of the people of Ukraine, we have another type of war going on in our country where people are displaced. People are losing their lives. There have been hundreds of people who perished in Dorian. As a matter of fact, I don't believe that we have an accurate count of those people who were lost at sea, even today, because we were the home of a number of Haitian immigrants who were, many of them undocumented, because there are legal as well as illegal people living in some of these islands, illegal insofar as they didn't have documentation. And so many of them did not go into shelters, and they were swept out to sea. And so that is a type of war that is going on in our country. And we have been crying for help. We have been asking the world to reduce these emissions. We've been asking the international community to come up with laws to govern carbon. And so far, we do not see any real progress in the international community.
You know, we see that increasingly in the United States as well, with the forest fires out west and the floods and the terrible consequences of climate change. You know, that's absolutely true everywhere. Well, I'm old enough to remember when to be an environmentalist was considered fringy. Those of us who really made an effort to recycle in college, you know, people would kind of, you know, raise an eyebrow. And one of the things that makes me hopeful, and I'm sort of an optimist by nature, is just to see this groundswell of interest in climate change and taking collective action. So it's so good to see everybody here and to see all the momentum that built up around COP this year. So I guess we don't really have time for questions. Was there anything else that you would like to add before we all take our seats?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much for this opportunity. We want to get the word out. Our country our economy is based on tourism. We have 700 islands in the sun. A whole lot of them are open for business, just about all of them. And we always like to say that despite the challenges that we have with climate change, that it's better in the Bahamas.
And there we can close with a sales pitch for the Bahamas. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
All right, let's get settled in our seats. We're about to begin our next session. Really quickly, let's give another hand to Ambassador Olofsdotter, Ambassador Jones, and to Sarah Jackson Hahn for moderating. What a wonderful, wonderful segment. I'm really glad to be here at American University because when folks ask me about American, I tell them that's the Activism University in D.C. I attended Georgetown and graduated there, and I love my school, but when it comes to advocacy, it's American that leads the way. And I think that's very clear. It's very obvious to everybody in the college community here. So thank you to all of you who step up every day to make our world a better place. We appreciate it. That brings me to our next segment, the role of activism. I have two extraordinary people on stage with us today. First is Tanya House, Executive Vice President for Campaigns and Advocacy at the Hip Hop Caucus, and Amanda Janoo, Economics and Policy Lead at Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Tanya House is the Executive Vice President for Campaigns and Advocacy at the Hip Hop Caucus and the Hip Hop Caucus Action Fund. She most recently was the Senior Program Officer for Voting Rights at the State Infrastructure Fund, where she managed the voting rights portfolio, including all national voting rights litigation funding. Prior to this, she was appointed by President Obama to serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for P-12 Education in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. Amanda is an economic policy expert with over a decade of experience working with governments and international development institutions around the world. Her work aims to build just and sustainable economies through goal-oriented and participatory policy design processes. Prior to joining WEAI, Amanda worked for the United Nations and the African Development Bank as an industrial policy and structural transformation expert. As a Fulbright researcher, she explored the relationship between international trade and informal employment. And I feel very unqualified sitting next to these two, let me tell you. Let's give it a hand, please. Tanya, I'm a big fan of Hip Hop Caucus and Reverend Yearwood.
I am too.
Just, yeah, that. I mean, the work that y'all do is incredible. Voting rights, violence prevention, anti-war advocacy, it's incredible. What does the Hip Hop Caucus do in the climate space?
Well, I appreciate the question. Oftentimes people think Hip Hop Caucus, climate. I don't understand that connection. But, you know, the caucus was founded in 2004. And we were founded after, if many of you heard of the kind of Vote or Die campaign that was initiated by hip hop artist P. Diddy and Jay-Z. And it came about as a call to action for Black and Brown communities, the hip hop generation, to be engaged. And one of the major issues that is impacting Black and Brown communities is our climate. We are the first and worst impacted. And the caucus has brought and has continued to bring to light this issue because we recognize that it is the only way that we can truly liberate our people and ensure that we are protecting not only the ability for us to thrive in this community, but also to ensure, maintain, enable opportunity and power building, but because it is the right thing to do. So we work within the hip hop generation, as we say, and that is expansive. Hip hop was founded, we're actually coming up on the 50th anniversary next year. And so when you talk about hip hop, it's not just the hip hop that you know today. It is the old school hip hop. That's what I grew up on. It is the entire generation, and talking about it as a way, engaging and utilizing cultural expression in order to ensure that we are engaging in political activism. And we utilize cultural expression in that way through artistry, through many mechanisms, and it's not just through using major celebrities as influencers, but also bringing to light and bringing community activism, community grassroots activists into the fold to understand how it is that we can make sure that we are educating our communities about what is truly impacting us on our day-to-day basis. And so that's why we are involved in this arena. Climate justice, environmental justice, it's critical to how it is that we can thrive as a community.
Absolutely. I can't believe it, 50 years?
50 years, 50
My
years.
goodness.
I know, we're old, right?
I feel very old right now.
I am. I will,
I am too.
Yeah. We're on, and I'll just say this, because I also want to hear from you, but we are on, this is our 18th birthday, and we're celebrating this year, and I like to say it because 18, you're able to vote. We utilize that as a mechanism to say, hey, we are here, we're a force, we've been doing this for all these years, and we will continue to do this. And so it's been a celebration, and so we were continuing to engage in this space right now. And in fact, the reason I'm here is because our founder and president, Reverend Yearwood, is literally on his way back from Egypt at COP27, somewhere in the air somewhere. And the rest of our team has finally landed. I got the texts and emails that they have finally landed. So it's a pleasure to be here, and so thank you so much for the opportunity.
I was a student in high school when those first ads came out from Siddiqui, and it's just amazing now that y'all are on 2 decades now of such stalwart advocacy on so many different fronts.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Terrific.
Amanda, can you tell us about the incredible scope of organization that your work that your organization does, please?
Yes, absolutely. Well, so the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is this beautiful network of visionary thinkers, organizations, governments, communities, activists, and change makers from around the world who are really united by this recognition that we have to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us. And so people join WEAll and come to WEAll from many different walks of life. So whether that's a commitment to, combating environmental degradation or biodiversity destruction, whether that's around mental health sort of promotion, inequality and gender, racial, like international income inequalities, but they all recognize that so many of these issues are just symptoms of a broader system that we have fundamentally designed, and that we have the power, if we come together and work together, to meaningfully transform our economic thinking and the design so that it works in service of social and ecological well-being.
And I'm going to start with you here. What does activism mean to you when it comes to climate?
When it comes to climate?
Specifically.
Yeah. I mean, so we have a lot of engagement with the sort of climate activist space. And I think that, you hear a lot of times the slogan, for example, systems change, not climate change. And I think that in and of itself, that sort of activist call is so significant in terms of recognizing that we need to stop putting Band-Aids on the system and just trying to tinker and mitigate the negative outcomes, and to really move upstream and to say, we have built a system that does not value any of our natural resources, environment, plants, animals, until they're transformed into the goods we see around us, right? So this is how Amazon can be the most valued company in the world, and the Amazon rainforest isn't worth anything till it's cut down. And this is not inevitable. This is a product of the ways in which we evaluate our societal success, the ways in which we understand and envision what really matters for our well-being now and for generations to come. And so to the extent to which activism is about shifting this narrative, moving upstream, and recognizing that we have the capacity to genuinely not only protect the environment, but to heal it and to provide for one another and to produce things in a way which is actually regenerative by design.
How can people who are outside of the space ascertain what is a Band-Aid and what is revolutionary?
Yeah, I think the simplest way is to keep asking why. Yeah, if you keep asking why. And so let's say the simplest thing I think that any individual can do, right? So let's say we're starting with this idea of how are we actually monitoring and assessing our progress. We are seeing, for example, this huge movement around the world of governments who are developing alternative indicators to GDP and assessing our national performance by social and ecological indicators instead. And that can feel kind of meta, but that's significant. And you can do that in your own life when you just ask people what they love about where they live. 9 times out of 10, it's the people and it's the nature. And when you say, once they identify that and they start to internalize and then question, okay, but then why aren't we focusing on those aspects? Why don't we really focus on, if it is the community and the culture and the sense of maybe trust or connection that we have within our community, then questioning what are the ways in which we could be designing an economy that actually supports those types of interactions and that kind of trust and that sense of meaning and purpose in our work and the ways in which we're contributing not only to society but our ecological sort of environment as a whole.
Absolutely. And Tanya, what does activism mean to you in the climate context?
So I think generally activism to me, is defined essentially as the spine of policy and advocacy. It is how it is we get things done. And when we talk about it, particularly within the caucus, within the Hip Hop Caucus, I often listen to Rev, and we've heard this before, but demonstration without agitation leads to frustration. That is a theme that we live by. And so and what that means from an activism context is that means that you have to have this outside agitation and the inside legislation. You have to have both in order to be an activist. You have to understand what is necessary in order to push that change from the outside, but then also understand what is necessary from the inside, and not simply sit back and say, okay, I've done my work on the outside, but you've got to understand how the systems work and what needs to be changed. And so I think both of those are required. And so that's why the caucus engages in both of that, outside agitation and that inside legislative work on a policy and advocacy front. We have different campaigns. We're activists in the context of, we have different platforms in which we engage. We have our Think 100% campaign. That's our climate justice, environmental justice platform. And that is where we ensure that we're educating, we're engaging and organizing people on the ground about the impact of the changes in our climate on Black and brown communities. We know that we really focus on also the impact, particularly in places like in Louisiana and Cancer Alley, right? Where we know that we have the highest concentration of petrochemical facilities that are truly causing devastation upon our communities. Looking at the Ohio River Valley, looking at places like this where we understand and we have to, and people are wondering, as you say, their everyday lives, like what is it that you care about? And people care about, why is it that my child has asthma? And why is it that my child is suffering from these illnesses that we didn't used to see as much? And that's where we bring to the forefront, we say, well, everybody can be an activist in their own right. One thing, just pick one thing it is that you want to change your community. It's not this big looming thought process. It's just, what is it that you want change right now? Is it that you want to ensure that we're not going to continue to maintain these zoning regulations that are enabling there to be continuation of pollution and plants put into Black and brown communities and not have the necessary financial resources in order to clean up the waste and the pollution that is killing ourselves and killing our communities. So that's what activism is to us. It is a continued education, is a continued ability to ensure that we are pushing legislation and advocating in the streets and inside Congress, inside the state and federal level, and everywhere that is necessary in order to make that necessary change.
Absolutely. Does your organization, do you feel that this upcoming generation is more attuned than ever to being able to suss out, and I'm trying not to cuss here, well, I'm just going to say it, to suss out bullshit in the policy space?
As a mother of two young boys, one that thinks he's a grown, but he's only 13, and who I just had a debate with last night, and I said, this isn't a debate. I'm your mother, so just do this. But yes, the answer to your question is yes. I do feel that this generation does have much more of an ability to discern the BS. And I say that when I speak about my children, because my 13-year-old looks at me, he's like, this is stupid. And I was like, I know. I recognize that, and you're right. It doesn't mean that we don't have to still continue to make change, and I think and they recognize it so much earlier. They recognize the illogic of what is happening to them, because they're the ones who are impacted. I mean, we're impacted now, but they're really going to be it's that generation. And so yes, I think that, and there are so many tools at their disposal right now, and that's why it is necessary for us to utilize the culture. What they're listening to, what they're reading about. They're on social media continuously. I wish I could get that phone away from my child. But on the other hand, that's a way to learn also and to understand and see what's going on. And so, yes, I think they can assess the BS, but it is also incumbent upon us to make sure that they understand what is real, what is not within that context, within the social media context, so that they have the proper tools to provide, to have that necessary discernment. But I think that because they're exposed so quickly to what is happening, and because they're naturally being impacted right now as we look and see why it is that it goes from 80 degrees one day to 40 degrees the next in September, and then all of a sudden, yeah, like right now I'm walking through here and wondering why I didn't have a thicker coat and a scarf on when it was 70 degrees last week. So, and that's the kind of thing. So yes, I think that there is a deep recognition of that, and I think that you're also hearing it through the culture that we are engaging in, the music, the poetry. It's coming out in various expressions that people don't even realize, and that's something that we're really trying to capitalize on and to make sure that we're pushing out into the community.
It's funny, when I was in high school, like 15, 20 years ago, it felt like, the stereotype for us was that we were quick to understand computers, right? Like we grew up with them. It feels like for this upcoming generation, there is a vocabulary to social advocacy they've picked up so much quicker than any of us. There are just things that come up that I just, I am astonished at the rapid nature of understanding with this generation when it comes to social advocacy. So the fact that y'all are organizing along that line is just a breath of fresh air. I love it. This is a question for both of you. What do you say to folks outside the climate space, or really outside any social advocacy space, who express a discomfort with the learning process? Maybe they feel uncomfortable, or they feel challenged, they feel like they are perhaps a little threatened by the newness of all of this. And I'm going to go first to, oh my God, I'm forgetting everything right now. I'm so sorry. Man, I'm going to go first to you, and then I'll go to Tanya.
First, just to clarify, what do you mean by the learning process?
Well, I mean, the idea that folks who may not be well acquainted with a space of advocacy may be intimidated by what they don't know.
Well, I would say that comes up a lot. If you deal with anything around economics or the economy, that I would say that that's the first major barrier you face, because the way that the economy is, I feel like, intentionally articulated is to make it feel very abstract, complex, and as simultaneously the area of life that is the most important and trumps every other consideration, but also the area of life that is too complicated for you to understand or get involved in. And so a lot of our work is around, shifting cultural narratives around the economy to remind people that we are the economy, that the economy is the way we produce and provide for one another, that it's a means by which we improve our collective quality of life. And so our capacity to design and evaluate its success in a different way is fully up to us. And so breaking out of this, and I see this a lot because if people come from the health sector, the environmental sector, they themselves can be very intimidated still by the economy and feel the need to make the case for why health is good for productivity in the economy. But why do they have to make that argument? We can swap that burden of proof and evaluate the economy by its contribution to our health, right? Because health is obviously a much more important, intuitively sort of outcome. And so I think there's something which is really about counterintuitive in the way that we currently talk about the economy. And so it doesn't take a lot, I think, to get people on board, but it is about empowering your own wisdom and your own knowledge based on your own life experience, and recognizing that you have a right and a responsibility to engage in these kind of discussions and this kind of advocacy, and envisioning this different sort of system. Because when we're talking about, especially, this younger generation, as it were, I am so incredible. It's beautiful to see, because we have a huge youth advocacy contingent, and that's amazing. But I also recognize the unique weight of the world that is on our shoulders now. There's so much anxiety and depression, and there's a lot of heaviness with the urgency of these issues. And once you really start looking at the environmental crisis, it's scary and it feels like too much, and you don't know how you as an individual can possibly make a difference. And so this is why urgency isn't enough. You also need hope, and to be able to craft hopeful alternative narratives, and to not only just focus on all of the different economic activities or corporations or sectors that are negatively impacting our environment, but to showcase those examples of the ways in which we positively contribute to our ecosystem and heal and restore it. So we can see and envision ways in which we can be, a beneficial part of this larger system.
And Tanya, same question to you.
So I think that there are, how do we really engage and help people to get past this concept of, this is a difficult concept for them to understand, right? I think that you take it one step at a time. I think, once again, you break it down into what is impacting you in your daily lives. This is essentially what it is that we do at the caucus. We come into your communities, we come into where you are in the spaces. We go to, for example, the comedy clubs. We hosted what we call a comedy tour, which ate your mama's heat wave. And it was essentially a comedy tour in which we had comedians talking, doing their regular acts, but really focused on climate justice and environmental justice and understanding. And these are spaces in where people can relate and say, oh, people go to different concerts, they go to these types of tours, and so we want to engage them in that space. We also create short movies and documentaries. Big Oil's Last Pipeline. That is one that we also created, in which we, again, try to educate people about, in a way that is in their portfolio, that is much more easily digestible, so that it's not necessarily us talking to you in a panel, forcing you to come and listen to us blab on and on and on. But it's wherever they're going to be. Not that we're doing that, but I'm just saying.
Not at all.
But the point is that this is not necessarily where you're going to find those that really we need to reach sometimes, because you all wanted to be here. You knew you need to be here. You're educated about this enough to know to come. And I'm hoping that you will then take that into other communities to educate them to say why they need to come to this. But we've got to get to people now also where they are. And so that's, for us, we try to break it down in a way that is digestible in their culture. And that's what hip hop is about. Hip hop is naturally disruptive in its conception. It's always about understanding, identifying and speaking to your reality, how it is that you exist. And right now, how we exist is dealing with the fact that the pollution is killing our communities, that petrochemical plants that are being put into our Black and brown communities are causing this type of sickness and illness that is resulting in this continual degradation of Black and brown communities. And so this is how we come to them and say, just come to the skating rink. We're just, here's a few things for you to take a look at. Come over here to this comedy show. Here's this movie. I mean, these are things, we actually also work with influencers and music and artists, Common, others to do some, either to do some different promotions, but also to do their own, create some music that will garner the attention of those where they are. And so that's how we feel that we can break it down and make it more accessible, because we know that we have to, and we know that it does seem, and I think, as we just stated, that this idea and this, what we're talking about, has been done in such a way that it is done in order to prevent those who are naturally, as I said, first and worst affected, to not understand and care about it, because they just don't get it. They feel like this is not something that they can digest. And so we're trying to break it down in a way and bring it to them in a way that they would naturally receive some information in any other context.
Absolutely. Let's stay here for a second. Can you talk about the Hip Hop Caucus campaign against PR and ad firms who support fossil fuel industry?
I appreciate that question. So we have what we call a creatives campaign, in which we are working with creatives, executives, those that are engaged, in the industry, and encouraging them to either, one, disassociate themselves with the fossil fuel industry and any ad or campaigns, and if they currently have those campaigns, to allow that to be the last one. And so it's kind of a pledge. It's an attempt, it's a campaign by us and working with others in order to move the agenda and to move and to create that structural change that we're talking about, the systemic change that you're talking about, because we have to stop that promotion. We also, we talk about this in our podcast. We have the coolest show, because we're cool, and so it's the coolest show in which that's another way in which you get this message out about how it is that we stop this pervasive advocacy of the fossil fuel industry. And we also encourage and we work, as necessary when there's specific campaigns, and you brought on Amazon, but also on social media, where there are campaigns that are targeting our communities. We'll send some notices, we'll send requests to the social media, to these particular platforms, requesting that these campaigns be brought down. Because similar to what has done, with the cigarette industry, similar to what has been done with other industries in the past, in which we now look back and say, how did you all allow this? Yeah, it took a large campaign. I remember those days. And so that's one way, and though not one, there's a few ways in which we're working in the industry in order to, as I said, to try to minimize and eventually eradicate this promotion of the fossil fuel industry through ads and campaigns.
I have about 1 million questions for you both. We only have 25 minutes and a couple minutes left only. So I'm going to end with this. What gives you hope? Let's start with Amanda. What gives you hope?
I mean, there's a lot of things that give me hope. For me personally, I joined WEAll about 3 years ago, and it's just the people that you get to meet when you work in these kind of areas, and the passion and the dedication that people have despite seeming odds. I get a sense now, and I'm able to engage from really community level kind of transformative, let's say, circular economy or regenerative economy initiatives, to national level new performance frameworks, to businesses that are transitioning from for-profit to not-for-profit, right? You see these transitions in a lot of seemingly disparate spaces, but together, what they end up illustrating is that a different economic system isn't only possible, but it's already underway. And so ultimately, I think there's a lot more that is working in our favor than is maybe working against us, but I'm also a bit of an optimist, so I'm probably, a bit overly, optimistic about the state of affairs, but I'm looking forward to seeing and understanding as well more about how we can support this transformation more in the United States as well, to connect in with the global movement, which I think is growing really rapidly.
Amen. Tanya can close us out.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you being an optimist. We need optimists in this world. And because we have to have hope. If we don't have hope, then people they're not able to envision the change that is necessary to create the world that we want to live in, and create that better society. What gives me hope is the same thing, the passion and the dedication. The people that I work with at the Hip Hop Caucus are so passionate. They're young people, and I call them my kids half the time, but they're not that much younger than me. But it is that passion and hope that they have within them to continually be out there fighting for the change that they see is necessary. That gives me hope. It gives me hope to know that we're finally at a point where I feel like we're having this conversation right now, that this is actually frontline. When I'm looking at headlines in the major newspapers. They're actually talking about COP27. They're actually talking about what is happening and why the Inflation Reduction Act. They're talking about the impact of how climate change is impacting Black and brown communities. That gives me hope, because it's at a point where people know that yes, we are at a precipice, but at the same time we can do something about it, and people know that. And so it gives me hope that we have this opportunity, and that we have people that are dedicated, and that we have a generation that is involved and that is ready to take the mantle, and that we have people like Amanda up here and everyone else out here that are engaged. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to continue to work with you all, and I look forward to moving that forward.
Tanya Clay House, Hip Hop Caucus, Amanda Janoo, Wellbeing Economy Alliance, thank you both so much for being with us today, and thank you for all the work you do. Let's give them a hand, folks, please. All right, folks, we're having a great day so far, right? Incredible folks, incredible people. We have another wonderful person coming up. I got to meet him earlier. Simon Nicholson, Director for the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity. He is an associate professor at the School of International Service here at American University. His research and teaching focus on global environmental governance, the intersections of technology and the environment, and carbon removal and solar radiation management responses to climate change. Simon is director of American University's Cross-Campus Center on Environment, Community, and Equity. He's also co-director of the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law, and Policy, and director of the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment. Folks, please give it up for Simon Nicholson.
Hi, everybody. So it's my pleasure to moderate two sessions this afternoon. A session in a little bit will be on the notion of vulnerability and how it ties to loss and damage, some of the other big conversations at the COP. This next session is on the food-climate nexus. I'm getting to moderate, and you've had Charlotte moderating for a panel or two, and it's going to be tough to keep up with what you've done. But what I want to do is just set this panel up, and then I'm going to invite a few of my American University colleagues to join us on the stage to interrogate this notion of where agriculture and food fit into the conversation about climate. So to set this up, one of the obvious connections between food and agriculture and climate is that agriculture and food provisioning contributes to the climate crisis. Something like a third of greenhouse gas emissions globally are attributed to the way that human beings grow and provision food. On the other side of this, climate change and the impacts associated with climate change are exacerbating food insecurity and other food challenges around the world. So we'll look at both of these notions today. At COP27, food has been on the agenda as it has not been at prior COPs. A full day was devoted by the Egyptian government to this notion of food and adaptation. And at the same time, even though a third of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, only about 3% of climate finance goes to the agricultural sector. So we've got to look at this. We've got to work out what it's going to take to bring food more fully onto the climate agenda and vice versa. So to help me do that, I'm joined by three colleagues from American University. I'll invite them now to the stage. Come on up, folks. First, we have Sauleh Siddiqui. Sauleh is an associate professor in environmental science here at American University. He's actually on leave, so it's a treat to actually see him on the campus today. He's on leave at the moment to serve as the United States' chief energy modeler with the Energy Information Administration at the U.S. Department of Energy. So welcome, Sauleh. I'm also joined by Tambra Stevenson. Tambra wears so many hats, it's impossible to know where to start in introducing her, but I'll invite you to reveal some of those hats for us as we move forward. Two things I'll say is that she's founder and CEO of a group called WANDA, which is Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture, and is also a PhD student in AU's School of Communication. And then we have Justine Williams. Justine is the Assistant Director of our cross-campus Center for Environment, Community, and Equity, and has had deep and long entanglement with food issues. So thank you all for joining us. Sauleh, I'm going to kick to you first and invite you just to respond to my setup. Tell me what I missed, tell me what you agree with, and then if you can bring in this notion of food waste and introduce some of the work that you've been involved with.
Great, thank you, Simon, and thank you all for being here and those signing in online. So yeah, I think, as you mentioned, the food system is a big contributor, not only to emissions, but a lot of other issues that are related to climate justice and working from the bottom up. Since you mentioned waste, like that's often seen as one of the issues with the food system. We waste up to 40% of all the food that is produced. And so when we look at that problem, often the first sort of instinct is to be like, how do I solve that? Right? And so you go after like, well, maybe we can compost more. Maybe we can reduce, reuse, and recycle more. Maybe we can take some of the unused food and then also provide it to people who don't have it. The issue, and this is the issue that we highlighted in our multi-university project, Multi-Scale Recipes for Sustainable Food Systems, is that when you look at something like waste, and you're wasting so much food, at the same time, so many people in the world and on this campus are food insecure, you realize that waste is not just the issue. Waste is just a symptom of the problem, right? Waste and the fact that there's so much inequity highlights that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system. And so if we try and go after solving the symptoms, we're actually not solving the underlying issues, right? Just the way that if we try and think about solving climate change or like incorporating climate justice, and we just focus on one or two symptoms of that, which are just emissions from one or two sectors, we're never going to get to a point where we're actually going to solve the problem. And so thinking from a bottom-up justice perspective not only is essential for the purposes of justice, but it's also essential for the purposes of reducing emissions and tackling the challenge of climate change. So a lot of people then ask, well, if you're not going to shame people into composting and you're not going to think about food donation, then how does this actually work? Like, what do you mean by systemic solutions? And we're actually very lucky to have Tambra and Justine on stage today, because I think some of the things that both of them can speak to are some of the systemic ways that they've gone about tackling this problem in a broader way than just trying to think about assessing the symptoms. So, Tambra, I won't take too much of it, but some of the Food Bill of Rights work that you've done and also some of the communications work, I think is purely pointing towards how you can think about systemic solutions as opposed to trying to just treat the symptoms. And Justine, some of your work also on land rights and sovereignty, I think that connects really, really well with the food system. So, Simon, to give a summary answer to what you asked, waste is important, all these issues are important, but it's very, very important, especially in the context of food, to look broader than just the symptoms. And I'm hoping both of you can help us do that.
So, Tambra, I'll invite you to take that prompt. Take it where you will.
No problem. First, I want to thank you all for being a part of the conversation, because one of the things that we know out of the School of Communication that we have to create discourse in order to shape minds, to shape public policy. And so this is where it begins. With that, we know that more than 59% of consumers through an EFIC 2020 study understood that they want packaging, they want food items that are sustainable, but another 60% don't know what their products are. And so we have a big opportunity for communications. And so as someone who started off at the low-hanging fruit of working with rat research, doing bone mineral research at Oklahoma State, where I'm from, to now be in social sciences, speaks to the testament of the value of what social sciences has to this conversation around addressing something that feels very much like just the typical food, nutrition, environmental science, which you need co-conspirators bringing their superpowers together. And so one of the key gaps and opportunities is looking at the consumer behavior aspect. We know that there is a need to educate people around how can they play a critical role in being empowered and have a sense of agency in moving the needle on these issues. That is not just the macro institutions like government and industry that play an important role, but when we have this collective power, taking it to the vote during elections time, voting for people who believe in these issues being top priority, making sure that they're held accountable when it comes to drafting legislation and speaking to changing, enabling an environment for all of us to thrive as food citizens, this is how we understand the role in which we can play. And so with that, food citizens, those who've been hidden figures in the food system, that the work that WANDA focuses on is understanding that those who came or were brought to this country to help build a food system that is in essence fragmented is now having to understand that we have to recognize the power that everyone can play in building a better food system. And so for us, our focus is women of color and how they are leading households, they're making impact and making decisions in the midst of the pandemic, being the lunch ladies, being the caregivers, being able to just practice self-care and understanding that how can they be activated with that inner food hero to say it's not enough to just consume product, it's also as important to lead and produce and also advocate for the changes that we want to see. And so having people envision themselves as food citizens is critical. And so this introduction of a Food Bill of Rights is an extension of this idea that we know the UN Declaration of Human Rights talks about the right to food, but how does it drill down in some real operational ways that speak to the changes that we need to see and making the connection between food, health, and sustainability? It's not there. And so the idea and opportunity with this most recent White House conference in hunger, nutrition, and health that I had the opportunity to participate, how can we use this current environment, people who are ripe to see the change in our food system, making the connection and integrating with the healthcare system, also integrated with the environmental system as well. And so this trifecta or Venn diagram that you can visualize is one where this is where we have to help people plan it while still being profitable, that you don't have to choose one or the other. And I think there's a way to go forward when we understand the power of social entrepreneurship and understanding how can we create new business models that speak to these areas and making the connection. And so communication plays a critical role in bringing that messaging, framing it in a way that people can see themselves and being the change that we want to see.
Thank you, Tambra. I'm really struck by this concept of the food citizen. I'm going to pass to Justine to maybe pick up on that notion in relation to your own work. And one of the other things I'm taking from your comments is we talk about food and climate, you know, at least in my own work, always as a problem, always as a challenge. And what you seem to be suggesting is that there's also a moment of opportunity here. Through this, how does one empower people to step into this moment of opportunity and do the work that needs to be done?
Yeah, at the most recent World Food Prize Dialogues in Iowa, I was on stage with, you know, a number of laureates like Lawrence Haddad and made the point, if we were to use gardening as a metaphor, how do we pull the weeds while plant the seeds of hope? And hope is having optimism, perseverance, and enthusiasm on life. If we're not taking an optimistic view and seeing the light and not fall into the darkness, how can we create the change that we want to see? So we have to see ourselves as gardeners, nurturers, being stewards of the earth, and being able to shed that life for others to see themselves as that gardener as well.
Justine, are you a gardener?
I'd like to be. I get to work with a lot of gardeners and farmers, and I'm so excited to be here talking about food and agriculture in this context where we're not separating them. Only a few years ago, or maybe a little more than a few, when I was in grad school, I remember having a professor who said, "Oh, that's so unique that you all are starting to talk about these two as connected," which is ridiculous, of course, and it's ridiculous to act as if these aren't so intrinsic to climate change. And it's so exciting that food and agriculture are finally at the table at COP this year. And another piece that I want to bring into it is that often gets left out is the question of land and land access. So if you think of who owns land in the United States, I think we can probably guess what that picture looks like. It's pretty homogeneous, it's pretty concentrated. And that's really a shame because the same way that we can be food citizens, the people who are growing our food have such a huge role in the environment and climate change. And unfortunately, all too often, the people who are the most visionary are the same people who are losing access to land. So I'm thinking of our amazing networks of Black farmers in the Deep South who have been doing some of the most inspiring work to change how food is being produced and have been doing it for many, many, many years. I'm thinking of women farmers in Iowa who, when they get passed on family land, for too often have been encouraged to, pass it on to a man instead. But when they do keep it, have been innovating some really wonderful work in no-till agriculture. So those are some of the connections that I'd like to think through.
Thank you. Sauleh, I'm going to come back to you. Your current role, as I mentioned in the intro, is as Chief Energy Modeler through the Department of Energy. So what do you bring to a conversation about food if your concentration is energy? I'm asking that question in part just to have us pull back to this kind of systems notion that you introduced to us. Help us see some of the connections here.
Sure, and just to clarify, I'm not here in my role as a federal government employee. So this is just my role as an American university professor, and in fact, even before I started researching on food, my original research was on energy. So I'm a mathematician by training. My research primarily has been for the longest time projecting what will happen to our energy system over the next 30, 40 years, and so. It kind of goes back to kind of, what Justine was saying and what Tambra was also alluding to is, it used to be that we divided ourselves into these silos to try and figure out like, okay, let's try and solve this problem first, then we'll try and solve this problem, and then we'll try and solve this problem. And as soon as climate change came along, it said, well, this is not just one of those buckets that you have to solve, you really have to solve all of them, right? And I think energy and food they're a good comparator in terms of like how much work has been done in one space versus what we know and don't know about another space, right? In some ways, research on food has an advantage because food is culture. Food is more connected to people. People can relate to it closer. Energy often seems like not related closely to what people are doing, but energy justice has become a very, very important issue over time, right? And so thinking about the burden of costs and those other things are also very, very important. But the other thing that a lot of research has not gone into yet is really the interconnections between our energy and our food systems, not just in the United States, but also globally as well, right? For those of you that have seen research on sort of, including cook stoves and like spreading those out globally and how that failed and how it didn't work, and in some cases it did, those are the types of tensions that show up when you try and look at a system as a whole rather than try and split it up into energy and food, right? And so for someone like me who started off in energy, the biggest thing was like, okay, there's so many things I know about the energy system, just primarily by doing research in it. And we collect a lot of information about the energy system. The thing I like to say is that when I was getting my PhD, if someone told me, someone told me where they were living and they turned on the gas stove, I could tell them probably where that molecule of natural gas came from, simply because we know so much about our system. Yet, the apple that I would eat this morning, I have zero idea where that apple comes from, who's been there, where the people that have been involved in getting it to my table. And so the fact that these two things are part of our life, but yet we don't know about their interconnections, and in the case of food, we don't know about it individually either, that speaks to something where we need to do a little bit more, both in terms of research, but also really understanding those interconnections.
Mm. So, Tambra, there are so many places we could take this. I want to have you come back into your communications self. One thing that Sauleh is telling us, reminding us, is just the complexities of all of these different arenas. Sometimes it's hard to work out how to untangle any of this stuff to find a point of traction or a place to begin, not just in thinking about it, but in taking action. If we think back to one of our sessions earlier today, we had ambassadors from Sweden and the Bahamas come and speak with us about the geopolitical headwinds that are in the face of those who are trying to take climate action at this international or global scale. Something like the war in Ukraine, it kind of takes the air out of the international conversation because it's immediate, it's pressing, right? Climate change and this relationship to food, on the other hand, are what cultural critic Rob Nixon has called slow violence, right? The onset of climate change and all of the challenges associated with our food system, they happen almost in slow motion. It makes it really difficult to see. So when you layer that on top of the complexities that Sauleh gave us, how do we start to untangle this and find an entry point?
Yeah, great question. As we saw between the last 2020 presidential election and in the pandemic, you have a lot of battling forces around mis and disinformation that's happening online, some intentional, it's seeking to distort and create harm so people can feel immobilized and not move and not take action. And so having those savvy media literate consumers or food citizens is critical to this conversation. And that's partly why I came over to SOC, even though I already had a master's in health communication from Tufts Medical, but really understanding, like, with the advent of social media, how does that change the game of this conversation? Because we have gatekeepers in the traditional media, while at the same time having those who are no gatekeepers when it comes to social media, where you can just take arm, create a digital army, and begin to attack whoever you wish, and in this case, climate issues. And so it's really important in this idea, one, of governance needing to happen within the system. There's a lack of internet governance that we have plenty of scholars that talk about it over at SOC, like former Dean Lauren Denardis, but at the same time, this idea of how can citizens in this role that they can play collectively be armed with information that's credible, that's informative, and that's also engaging and persuading. And I think being able to think through a variety of ways, whether it's campaigns and challenges to engage them, incentivizing them, rewarding them, the same concepts that we know in shifting behavior. One, there's several different emotional pills that we learn in comms, whether it's fear pill, the one I don't really like to choose to use, but we've seen it pretty much in a lot of different presidential campaigns. And then you have the hope appeal, which we also saw in a presidential campaign. And then we have consequential appeal, this idea of A plus B equals C. And when you see the severity of how it can have direct impact on your immediate life, that can create this behavior change. And so how can we leverage the technologies to have people begin creating the messages that motivate their family, their friends to create action? And so part of my interest, even the work that I'm doing here, is communication interventions and how can we incorporate different ways to do that. And so, for instance, we have one way to take action, IamWanda.org. If you hit that website /Food Bill of Rights, you can go in, sign the petition, get the message to President Biden that we need this Bill of Rights. You can then share it to your friends and begin to push the conversation of saying, like, why don't we have this document that can inform the future food and nutrition policy and make the connection how these digital tools can be used for digital activism and change that we want to see. So I think there is an opportunity. In other words, one of the things with this whole new ICANN initiative on basically climate action and nutrition that came out of COP27 in Egypt is, one, making the stance from the UNWHO perspective that these two are linked, and now how can that flow at the state, national, local level, and even academic settings of what kind of initiatives that we can use. So me and Justine are on a panel later this evening at 6 o'clock that's student-led, looking at food security, and this is one way in which we can start having a conversation with students about, within your respective field, how can you become armed with knowledge? How can you incorporate that into your work? We just had a conversation in a lecture I gave on environmental justice at the business school. Who would have thought, at the business school? But this is how you begin making this silo smashing connection that regardless whether you're in business, in government, in communication, in academia, that we all can play a critical role in moving the needle on the issues around climate.
I hear a lot of talk about breaking out of silos, but silo smashing, I think, is the term that I want to adopt.
Silo smasher.
Hey, just give us the website one more time for the Food Bill of Rights.
IamWanda.org /Food Bill of Rights.
IamWanda.org /Food Bill of Rights. So Justine, Tambra's taken us to actions, the sorts of things that need to be done to untangle all of this and to start to do the necessary work. One thing that we're starting to talk about is a gathering in March next year around the Farm Bill. And so if you're willing, maybe we can talk about that just a little bit. And then also, as you think of all of this and the kind of land's angle to it, tell us some more about the sorts of actions that are needed.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are excited to be planning for a Farm Bill Summit this March at AU. That'll be focused on pointing the Farm Bill towards racial justice with an eye towards climate justice as well. And the Farm Bill, is of course notoriously huge and complicated. It covers everything from food and nutrition to the way our farmers get access to funds. So it's really sprawling and it's really overwhelming for people to engage in. And I think we were talking earlier about how sometimes things become intentionally complicated. But this, of course, is about some of the most basic things that affect us. So in March, we are going to see hundreds, maybe, I don't know, thousands of farmers coming to Washington, D.C. To go and talk to their policymakers on the Hill and talk about what they need to actually grow food in a way that is sustainable rather than just in a way that the market is dictating and not paying them very well for. So the summit we're having is specifically focused on racial justice and questions of land. So a lot of work has been done over many years to address the issue of Black land loss here in the U.S. There's been some tiny incremental steps forward over the past year, but unfortunately, most people still feel like the U.S. Department of Agriculture hasn't lived up to its promises. There have been years of financial mismanagement, not making it easy for many farmers to get loans. So we're going to be talking about this, but we're not just going to be talking about the challenges. We also want to talk about the opportunities and what it looks like when communities are really thriving and really doing exciting climate innovative agriculture. So I'm very excited for that. When it comes to land, there's a lot that we could do. There's a lot, I think, that we could think about in terms of what other countries are doing that doesn't seem as natural in terms of land allocation in the U.S., making vacant lands available. I lived in Cuba for a number of years, and there are some good things and a lot of bad things about how food and agriculture works there. But any farmer who wants to farm can fill out paperwork and get land. And so there are local areas in the U.S. that are looking at more kind of U.S. appropriate answers to this question. There are cities that are looking at putting vacant land towards production. And there are all sorts of kind of smaller ways that we can think about helping young farmers to farm as well.
Beautiful. So continue in the same vein, if you would, Sauleh. Let's go back to this food waste issue. Wave your wand and tell us what a world without food waste starts to look like.
So I'll answer this question probably not in the way people were expecting. I'm not sure going to zero waste is what we're looking for, right? And I'll tell you why. If I were to tell you that we're in a world of zero waste, but what that means is that food inequities have increased across the country. It means that food prices have risen quite a bit. It means that food is being very, very carefully controlled and monitored. I'm not sure that's a world we might want to be in, right? At the same time, let's say we even solve all those issues, right? Like where we somehow figure out how to make the food system equitable, we figure out a way to reduce our waste to zero. The next time a pandemic strikes or some other shock to the system strikes, right? Do we have the ability to actually react to it, right? And so I think the first thing I'll say is I think that's the wrong question to ask. Like the question, even in terms of researching wasted food, the question shouldn't be how do we get down to zero waste? The question should be how do we fundamentally transform our food system by minimizing and managing these symptoms that we're seeing, right? And so the goal shouldn't really be to reduce wasted food. It should really be thinking about sustainability, equity, and resilience, right? So the idea that we're living in a world with our food system so that it's sustainable, it's not emitting as much as it's emitting right now, that it's equitable, so the people who need to eat the food, or everyone is getting that food and has access to the food and availability of that food, but also resilience. So next time we go through a shock, what happens? And so I can't wave my magic wand. You know, that's one of the issues of being a researcher. But I can tell you where some of the biggest gaps are, right? Like, so I hinted at that a little bit before in my answer before that. One of the biggest gaps is just in information. There are a lot of other systems we know a lot about. We know very little about our food system comparatively, and we know even less about wasted food. And so, really figuring out ways that we can learn more about this system is one way. The other big thing to aim for is, you know, and I'm going to borrow Tambra's term, the silo smasher. If we can turn ourselves into silo smashers, you know, in terms of the food system, and so how we've sort of segregated out different parts of it, so that we don't have to think about it, right? Like every time we eat a type of food, we don't have to think about where it came from and who were the people involved in it, and not just that, but also the different areas of knowledge, right? Like the engineers, the public health people, mathematicians like myself, social scientists, anthropologists. These are some of the places where we have to smash the silo, because this system impacts all of us and all those disciplines. And so I think if I were to wave my magic wand, those were the two things that I would kind of ask for, is smashing some of those silos, getting a little bit more information, and I think that'll lead us more towards a system that's better than what we have right now.
I just wish I had a wand to give you. Tambra, so one of the links here, of course, is to COP27. If you were in a room with the leaders of the world today and had a couple of asks of them, what would they be?
That's awesome. I mean, we know that most recently President Buhari spoke out in the Washington Post op-ed around this issue about just how do we reframe the conversation of not blaming the global south for these issues, and Western countries taking responsibility and their culpability in all of this. And so I think like any AA program, I would say first take beyond the serenity prayer, like just acknowledge your role and responsibility in all this. And so once we can come to that, then we can take the responsibility, the accountability into place, and then have the awareness of what our behavior has done to the planet. And then what action steps can we take together in moving forward and not backwards. And so part of those action steps for me, you know, in transparency, I'm on several different working groups with Tufts Food and Nutrition and Innovation Council, and we have a sustainable nutrition working group. And some of the recommendations that came out of that is, one, we need to do data sharing. We know, having been in government, data equals dollars. So if you don't have any baseline of collecting and understanding where we are, we can't make the incremental change that we want, and really call for the programming, the policy, the practices that need to address the issue. So one, let's silo smash and integrate data and making the connections between climate, ag, and nutrition and health. The other part of that data is informing how to change consumer behavior and be able to understand how can we set aside a communication fund dedicated to climate nutrition, where people who are looking to who don't have, especially advocacy groups who don't have comms budgets in place, be able to tap into a fund and support that. I know a fund like that kind of exists here in the U.S., but I think that should be more widely known and available and resourced to where we're able to not only fund nonprofits, but maybe academic, doing partnerships with industry, because being able to make these linkages of everyone's superpower is critical, and coming up with like one message, one agenda on how can we move the needle. And then lastly, obviously, sign on to the Food Bill of Rights. Like, not only like have our new third term Mayor Bowser incorporated into my work with DC Food Policy Council, but this idea of it being part of a wider toolkit to help local food policy councils who need to have some sense of governance of their own food citizens to be able to elevate it to the global level and say, can we harmonize and be of one accord of acknowledging that these are basic rights that we need as citizens on this planet? Access to land, access to food, access to health. That should be standard, just like we make it standard that you should have access to guns. If we can say that's part of national security, this food, ag, nutrition security is also part of national security, and I say that as a former born national security education scholar.
Justine. So one of the things that we do in the School of International Service and more broadly on the American University campus is equip and train the next generation of change makers and leaders. So give us the call to action pitched at students.
Yeah, that's so exciting. I think what I would want to say to students is there are a lot of ways to do this work. And I think that a lot of people come out of university programs thinking that the only way to do it is to, you know, become someone who will sit at a microphone and say smart things that you've read in books. And I think that we really need all hands on deck. And so something that I've been thinking about a lot is just how we need to valorize all the different roles in this work and this activism. Like communications work is so important. Logistical work is so important. So I just feel like it's so important to find the one thing that you're really good at and then tap into the movement that way. Because I've been part of so many organizations where everybody kind of wants to be out there being the smart person with the microphone, and we can't get anything done. And, you know, if what you're really good at doing is serving food or taking care of children, that's part of it too. So I feel like this is such systemic work, and finding your way to kind of plug it in and see how it connects to all these different parts is so important. I don't know if that's the answer you were expecting, but that's what's been on my mind.
I wasn't expecting anything particularly. I was just asking the question, but that was a fabulous answer, Justine. Thank you. We've got just a handful of minutes left, so we've got time for one more quick whip around if there's anything you want to make sure we don't forget to say.
So I'm actually just gonna just keep going on Justine's answer, because I really appreciated your answer. And I think one of the things that students need to realize is they've already done a lot, you know, like and I'll tell you, like, even small things, right? Like me being in my classrooms, my students challenging me, like, you're not teaching us about this, you need to teach us about that. That has a ripple effect. That is what led to me changing the type of research I do, me studying new things, telling my colleagues about it. You know, even within our department, you know, our students demanded that they wanted certain types of courses and certain types of knowledge. And so even with that, right, like I think even beyond students and just individuals, we've really done a lot. We've really been pushing, and it's been paying off. So really just encourage everyone to, you know, if you feel like you're doing something and you're like, okay, the solution is not here yet, I see change like this every day. I see it in the classroom, I see it in my daily life. So keep doing that, because it really, really does have an impact. Even if it seems like, oh, it's one American university class, how far will I go if I just challenge this random professor? It can go pretty far. And you know, and I can guarantee you that the stuff I've seen, that's evidence of that.
And I just want to jump on that. So I have a 12 and a 13-year-old, and I'm the parent who turns on the motivational videos on the drive to school. And the one this week that applies to this conversation was a video on self-advocacy. And I told my son, who's a high school freshman, wanting to be a robotic engineer, about the need is no matter how smart you are, we know you're smart, you came here to the university, but can you advocate for yourself? This is the dress rehearsal of life. And so if you're able to take advantage of the opportunities and speak up to your professor and tell them this is what you need to be able to feel whole and healed, and your parents got the return on investment that they made for your education, that's what we want to see. We want to see leaders being born today, not tomorrow, because we need change now. And that is beyond the messaging of AU, but understanding that universities are a hotbed of the academic freedom and debates that we need to help shape the minds of the future leaders who are going to lead custom, not only countries, but institutions and their communities, most important. And so I hope you understand, like, this is where it begins, you being that change leader right now in the classrooms, on campus, and across your community.
Do you mind if I take the last 30 seconds, Justine? So I want to give deepest thanks to We Don't Have Time for the partnership and for all the work that's gone into making this event happen. I look forward to other events that we might do together. I just want to finish on a personal note for the School of International Service. The School of International Service here at American University lost a colleague this week, our dear colleague Chuck Call. I wish Chuck were in the room with us. We are all going to miss his voice and peace building and all of the generative work that he has done with our students and our communities. So if I can make a dedication for the work that we're going to do moving forward, it's to Chuck and his legacy. So thank you again to We Don't Have Time, and we'll move on to our next session.
Thank you, Simon Nicholson. Thank you, Tambra Stevenson, Sauleh Siddiqui, and Veronica Limeberry, so much for that great panel. Folks, I'm going to bring back up here Sarah Jackson-Hahn, Senior Advisor Communications, Partnerships, and Policy at UNDP for a great fireside chat. Come on up here, Sarah. Let's give her a hand. Oh, I'm so excited for this chat. Okay, so right out of the gate, big question for you. What is the Don't Choose Extinction campaign, and how is it unique to addressing climate change?
So glad you asked that question.
Okay, good.
Don't Choose Extinction is an advocacy campaign that UNDP colleagues of mine, who are absolutely brilliant, dreamed up in 2020. It launched in 2021, and the goal of the campaign is to raise awareness and stimulate opposition to fossil fuel subsidies. Not something that all of us necessarily think about every day, but I'm thinking, why don't I tell you more after we watch the video?
I would love that. Let's cue the video.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
Okay, that's pretty damn cool.
Every time, I have seen that video so many times, every time I just crack up watching it. I think it was so clever. But it was a first. There's never been a computer-generated dinosaur in the UN General Assembly before. Many of the actors that appear in the video are my colleagues and UN employees, and it was a great disappointment to me that I wasn't actually able to go up and be an extra in that film.
It needs to be a Super Bowl ad. It really does.
It's, right.
It's so good.
Yeah, it was. I knew the minute I heard about it, I thought this is just absolutely brilliant.
And can I say real quick, the T-Rex was very nuanced and informed. I'm not sure a Velociraptor would have been as empathetic.
And I don't think it's actually an Utahraptor.
An Utahraptor.
An Utahraptor, which I had never heard of before, and I don't actually know who came up with that. But it's a pretty comprehensive campaign, and it came about. Apparently, I just learned this recently. My colleagues were all at a communications retreat in early 2020, and thinking about what the advocacy message should be, because the UN does a lot of advocacy. But what is it that you want to ask people to do? Advocacy is so tricky. One of our other panels have touched on this as well. So much of it is about finding the sweet spot. What's the message that's really going to motivate people? It needs to be clear, it needs to be concrete, it needs to be specific. And so they're talking about this. And one of our senior colleagues said, well, it's staring you right in the face. The big issue is fossil fuel subsidies. And, people kind of looked at each other and went, huh? And he explained the world spends, $400 billion a year subsidizing the fossil fuel industry.
And for those who don't know, what are fossil fuel subsidies?
They're either direct subsidies or they're tax breaks given to, coal companies, oil companies. I think the United States spends about $20 billion of potential taxpayer revenue a year subsidizing coal and oil companies. And so essentially what we're doing by doing that is, robbing money from other good causes and subsidizing our own extinction. All these terrible externalities in the environment. So that quickly became the advocacy messaging for UNDP that year. And it has been a tremendous success. If you go to our website, you can follow Frankie the Dino on social media. Frankie has been traveling around the world and made an appearance at Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. And there's some great video online about that. But it involved numerous partnerships. There's a children's book called The Birds and the Bees, which is actually about the planet, not about what we usually think of when we talk about the birds and the bees. We have a partnership with Global Mind Pool, which collected a lot of public opinion and polled people, it was so that's where we are.
You just made a really good point. $20 billion, but where could that otherwise be put forward in helping fight climate change?
It could be put forward in so many different ways. And I think, when people ask me that question, I always come back to the Sustainable Development Goals. I've got my SDG pin here. They're not as well known necessarily in the United States as they are in other countries, but you can look at those 17 goals as guideposts, areas where we could be investing, that $20 billion from the United States or $400 and some billion from the world. Clean water, sanitation, climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. There's so many things we could be doing, and we could be investing money, not just in saving the planet, but also in saving humanity. There's a record number of people right now who are displaced, either internally or externally. Billions of people live on less than $2.50 a day. Imagine trying to feed a family on that and provide shelter. There are just so many different ways. And conflict. There are more than 50 countries in the world that are riven by conflict right now. We could be investing that money in development, in peace building, in prevention of crises, instead of subsidizing our own extinction.
What's been the response to this campaign that you've seen so far?
It's been huge. I think we had stories written in 5,000 media right off the bat. We did the video in a number of different languages. We showed it in cinemas, we had an alliance with SAWA, the Cinema Association, showed it in, I think, 30 countries around the world for 8 weeks. And so it's gotten huge traction. One of the things, some of these things are difficult to quantify, but one great thing about social media and, online media generally is that you can measure how many people are watching, how many people are retweeting, and it's just been astronomical.
And let's brag a bit here, because I'm also in comms, and I've been in comms for a long time. Those are big numbers. 5,000 different outlets, that's huge.
That was just right off the bat. That
is a wildly successful campaign.
It was, and hats off. It was my colleagues, mostly in New York and in some of the Scandinavian countries and elsewhere. It was a brilliant idea. I think, one of the most important things that they did was to build partnerships. So UNDP had absolutely no budget for this campaign. Everybody donated their time. Our Goodwill ambassadors donated their time. We had lots of very famous actors who did the voiceovers and got involved. Our Goodwill ambassadors shared it widely.
So that was created with donated time.
Yeah, donated time.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it's but the partnerships are absolutely key. And I think someone I was speaking to the other day, reminded me that for 26 years, no one mentioned fossil fuel subsidies at the COP meetings. And it's now on the agenda. People are actively talking about phasing out fossil fuels and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. So that, to me, is one of the most important benchmarks of success. Obviously, that wasn't entirely because of our dinosaur, but it was clearly the right message at the right time.
So we have a lot of communications professionals and policy experts, including one on the stage with you right now, who are wondering, it's so hard sometimes to do comms on climate change. Yeah. How do you approach it? How do you make it effective?
You know, again, I think a lot of it is finding the sweet spot. What message is going to resonate with people? I've always thought that health was a particularly human health, and the impact of climate change on human health is absolutely a sweet spot. I think there's so much doom and gloom out there. I know so many young people who don't want to deal with it and say that they never want to have children because the climate is going to hell in a handbasket. But I think using humor, reminding people, surprising them. I mean, who thinks of a dinosaur when you think of climate? But everyone loves dinosaurs. I think using humor, using surprise, empowering people, letting them know that there are concrete actions they could take, and advocacy and civic engagement are so important. It's the only way we're going to get change, really.
Let's say you headed straight from here to an Oval Office meeting with President Biden, and President Biden were to ask you, okay, what unlimited resources, we can do whatever we want. I'm just going to hand over the reins to you. What would you do?
Good question.
To educate the world?
To educate the world, I would say, I'm an optimist. I have a huge faith in science, in medicine, in data, and technology and innovation. I would say invest in renewable energies, invest in better infrastructure and climate change adaptation and mitigation, and don't hold back. We have the science. I believe we're at a tipping point. The price of renewable energy, the price of storing energy, all these things, are affordable. They're within our grasp. And we're fools if we don't seize the moment and run with it.
Absolutely. So I went macro there. I'm going to go micro. In a week, everyone's going to head home for, Thanksgiving, Friendsgiving, whatever you want to call it. They're going to sit around with people they love at a table and eat. Climate change is probably going to come up at a lot of these tables. How would you advise someone to engage in this topic with friends or relatives who may be a little reluctant to talk about climate change or deny it even?
Yeah. It's a good question. Well, one of the things I would say is everyone should show the Frankie the Dino video to all of their relatives. The idea is that's a tool you can use to get people engaged and to get them to start thinking about it. And I think just talking to people about the things that we observe changing in front of our very eyes are undeniable. These extreme weather events, climate refugees all over the world, and just sometimes you have to broach it delicately, but there's no denying that the world is changing and the climate is changing.
You got a lot of students here, some of whom I assume are going to go into comms someday. God help you. And what would be your advice to them as they're entering this field of advocacy?
Look for the sweet spots. Look for partnerships. Look at data. Look at polling data. You want to find just the right entry points. And technology has made our jobs both more difficult and easier in some ways. There are so many different channels. You want to cut down on the noise. I think one of the reasons this campaign was so successful is because it's simple, it's clear, it's concrete, and everybody is overstimulated these days. You got to hone your messaging, find partnerships, and just be relentless.
Absolutely. Well, this whole thing has been positive, but let's end on a solidly positive note. What gives you hope?
Honestly, I said this earlier today, to see so many young people really engaged on the climate issue and paying attention to international issues absolutely inspires me. I have 2 daughters in their 20s, and when I listen to them and their friends talk about these issues and see how engaged they are, it just gives me enormous hope. And I have huge faith in science. And the more we can bring the conversation back to data and science, the better.
Sarah Jackson-Hahn, thank you so much. This is a lovely conversation. Folks, please give it up for Sarah.
Thank you.
All right, folks, I'm going to invite back up to the stage our friend Simon Nicholson, I apologize. Simon, are you here? Oh, there he is. Hey, Simon. Director, Center for Environment, Community, and Equity here at American University. Simon Nicholson, everyone give it up.
Thank you, Charlotte, and nice to be back with you all. Let me invite my colleagues straight up onto the stage, if I may. Come on up and join me. This next session is about the notion of vulnerability. So the thread throughout the entire set of sessions today has been about climate justice. One of the starting points for any climate justice conversation is the observation that those who have done least to contribute to the problem of climate change tend to be on the front lines when it comes to climate impact. An implication of that observation is that climate action ought to center the needs and the perspectives of those who are most vulnerable. We're going to look in this panel at this notion of vulnerability. What is it? What does recognition of vulnerability demand in terms of just climate action? How does vulnerability tie to big themes at the COP, like loss and damage and climate reparations? So to look at these sorts of questions, I'm joined by three colleagues. Malini Ranganathan, who's Associate Professor here in American University's School of International Service. Mubashir Rizvi, who's Professorial Lecturer in AU's Department of Anthropology. And Niranjali Amerasinghe, who's Executive Director of ActionAid USA. Thank you all for joining us. Malini, I'm going to kick straight to you for setup. I wonder if you can make this link between vulnerability as a notion and how it relates to the concept of climate justice.
Well, as you rightly said, at its most basic, climate justice, or rather climate injustice, refers to the fact that those who bear least responsibility for climate change suffer its greatest ravages, and conversely, those who bear most responsibility are relatively unscathed by climate harms. And so we take the example, for instance, of Pakistan. It contributes less than 1% of carbon emissions, but it's among the top 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change. I think what's really key to keep in mind about climate injustice, and I'll link it to climate vulnerability, is that it's not just some sort of static conception of poverty that explains this disproportionate susceptibility to harm, but rather the notion of climate justice really seeks to recognize and redress historical and systemic causes of harm. And so the concept of climate vulnerability is empirical in its outlook, and it really seeks to try to analyze and study at various scales the factors, the underlying political, economic, social factors that are both macro in scale as well as meso and micro in scale that predispose certain groups to climate-related harm. And so be that at the most micro scale, relations of land and access to land, access to relative forms of credit, to the macro scale, which is, for instance, a country or a region's debt history, right? To what extent have they been paying debts externally and have not been able to, therefore, channel public resources to climate adaptation, or to trying to even recover from disasters. And so both of these concepts, I think, are really important, and they're sort of companion concepts. And, in a word, disasters don't just descend from the heavens, right? Disasters are a disaster precisely because of underlying factors that actually create the disaster in the first place. And for me, in my research, I'm really interested in sort of the macroeconomic, political economic factors, as well as the micro relations, in a word, of power, right? It's very important to do these power analyses when you're understanding vulnerability.
Just say more about that, Malini. So I think many of us, when we think of disasters, we use language like acts of God, or we talk about natural disasters, but it sounds like you're saying something different.
Well, absolutely. there's a sort of famous saying, there is no such thing as a natural disaster, right? In the sense that a disaster isn't just an act of God. It doesn't just descend from the heavens, be it a drought, be it a hurricane, right? Be it a catastrophic monsoon flooding, right? The factors that are sort of embedded in the social system, the unequal relations of power, the unequal relations related to race, class, gender, ethnicity, religion, these are what kind of make a disaster happen, particularly for certain groups and not others. And so the social causes of disaster are really what I think vulnerability research tries to emphasize.
Yeah, Mubashir, if we can turn to you. You've been focused recently on Pakistan. Can you set this up for us?
Yeah, and I think it's about, as many of you, I'm sure, witnessed or saw on television screens for a brief moment, this biblical, going back to the hand of God, flooding that happened in that particular way. And there's no other way of talking about it because that's our automatic reaction, right? 30 million people displaced, 1/3 of the country underwater. How else can we think about it rather than this kind of almost like a natural process? But just following up with what Professor Raghunathan was saying is that part of the vulnerability that is, and now we saw it unfolding in Nigeria, and in the summer we also saw a whole host of issues coming up in the American South. Within Pakistan, the people who are the most vulnerable, let's say if you were to go to Islamabad or Lahore, you will not feel like 1/3 of this country is underwater. In the kind of posh regions of Karachi or Lahore, people are going to the malls and cinemas and they're talking about the blockbuster films. Because of the visibility and invisibility of vulnerability, we are living in the United States and we have places like Flint, Michigan, where they still have had, like as you've written, clean water provided in terms of, it's a questions of infrastructure and how do these, what we call natural disasters, are exacerbated by histories of how, for example, certain decisions were made about dams, barrages, canals. As the previous panel was talking about, it was to create a particular kind of agriculture and food system, to create a lot and be able to produce and yield supply cotton for the world economy. So this is a kind of legacy that goes back to the British colonial rule, where you have a particular form of agriculture that was put in place in many of the places that experienced extreme flooding in Pakistan, which led to the exacerbation. So the water, you would have like climate events, epic climate events, but water would often drain into the Indus towards the ocean, or with the drainage canals, especially after independence of India and Pakistan, the creation of large dams as a solution of water sharing between India and Pakistan with the help of World Bank. The idea was to create massive dams for storage, which helped and aid economic growth. But that model of economic growth is a very narrow understanding of a kind of economic development that doesn't always filter down to the peasantry always. This is something we were talking about, thinking through systems. Ecological sustainability would have required listening to local communities and their ways of thinking about floods and how to think about economic development that works in conjunction with local needs, as opposed to kind of national development modernization theory, which saw singular resource as a way of developing an entire economy, therefore making the entire country vulnerable. So I'm coming at it in a roundabout way, but I'm trying to show that 30 million people would not be underwater today if it wasn't for the particular decisions that were made about dam constructions, canal irrigations, and putting all our hopes into cotton or a different type of food system that allows for economic development, therefore. But in actually what it led to was extreme forms of vulnerability passed out to some of the poorest people in Pakistan.
Thank you. I mean, one feature of what you're talking about is this community level and what it means to listen to communities and the forms of action that are taken in response to climate change or in what we term development. Niranjali, as Executive Director of ActionAid USA, I wonder how community voices and working with communities figures into your work.
Sure, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss this great work that's centered around communities. I'll start by saying that at ActionAid, we work alongside communities to try to shift power from elites and more to communities, because we believe that communities need to be at the heart of the decision-making that affects them. And to build on what's already been said, in the context of climate change and climate impacts and vulnerability, I'll give you a couple of examples from work that we've been doing in Africa. We just put out a report on Monday that talked about women and girls confronting loss and damage in Africa, where our colleagues in Kenya were talking about how with the drought in the Horn of Africa, that exacerbated food insecurity. I mean, this is already an area that is food insecure, but it exacerbated the problem even more than it was before. And with the loss of income, what happened for women and girls in the community was that women in particular, if there were women farmers, they had less access to whatever relief programs were put in place. They didn't have as much access to food. And girls stopped going to schools, right? And in some extreme cases, they're married off because they can be a source of wealth if they can be married off from the community. So you can see how the underlying cultural and economic marginalization, both of the community and then women and girls within that community, has a disproportionate impact on them. In Zambia, we had colleagues talking about how a loss of income as a result of climate-induced food insecurity led to gender-based violence. And this is something we also saw at the start of the pandemic, where the gender-based violence numbers really spiked in certain countries as a result of the crisis. So it is really important to understand vulnerability, not just as a poverty issue, right, but of this intersectional issue that brings in multiple things to the front. And there is power then in working alongside communities to understand how can we empower women, right? How can we build safety nets? How can we change cultural perspectives about what to do in a crisis, so you don't end up selling your girls into marriage or selling the only livestock you have because that's all you can do to respond to the crisis. That's at a community level. But I also wanted to pick up on what you were saying, Malini, about debt, because this is another crisis that we've seen, right? The compounding crisis of debt and climate. And in the last few months, in recent history, Zambia and Sri Lanka have faced massive debt crises, as well as climate-induced challenges that they were facing in the country. And what often happens, right, is, so there's a debt crisis, they're going to default, and then you go to a lender of last resort, like the IMF, they tend to be the lender that comes in, and your debt gets restructured, you get a loan, but where does the loan go? It goes to servicing the debt that you can't get relief from. What's that debt? Most likely private creditors. BlackRock, for example, in Zambia holds a huge amount of Zambia's debt, right? So there's no fiscal space for developing countries who are already climate vulnerable and have other challenges, development challenges they're dealing with. You put a debt crisis into the front, and the relief package doesn't actually help them solve any of the issues that are causing the debt crisis in the first place, and they end up in a vicious cycle of debt.
You look like you want to jump in, Malini.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Niranjali. Thanks so much. And in particular, small island developing states, nations of the Caribbean have talked about this debt climate cycle, because what's happening is that actually climate change is debilitating several of their systems, their agriculture, their infrastructure, and so then they borrow often after disaster or to recover from the slow onslaught of climate change. It's not always a disaster, right? It's the everyday steady wear of climate. It's what people have often calling, slow violence. But so they borrow, and then when they borrow, there's conditionalities attached to it. So they might not be able to actually finance healthcare or finance the things that are being affected by climate change, right? Which then puts them in an even worse state the next time a disaster strikes, which causes the need for debt again.
Which takes us from the community through the national level, and now let's tie to the COP. Yeah. And Niranjali, if we can turn back to you just to help us work out how these sorts of notions have figured in the conversations over the past couple of weeks in Egypt.
Sure. I do want to set the stage by saying that obviously the discussions around vulnerability and climate change have been happening at the COP level since the very beginning of the conversation, in particular in the push for adaptation to be recognized as a very important issue for vulnerable countries, for developing countries in particular, and in the obligations that exist for developed countries and richer nations to provide finance to the developing world to help adapt to climate change. One of the big issues that has emerged in the last few years, however, is loss and damage. Now, this is something that has been talked about for a very long time because the countries that face loss and damage have been facing this already, but it's only gotten onto the COP agenda in the last few years or so in a big way. And at the COP in Egypt, the loss and damage finance conversation is probably the biggest conversation that is happening right now. The developing world is asking for a dedicated loss and damage finance fund or facility of some kind because the existing financial flows are largely going to mitigation and adaptation. It's not enough, by the way, to meet the costs that developing countries have, but there's been less attention to loss and damage finance. Now, some will say, well, there's insurance and there are disaster risk mechanisms and financing, humanitarian aid, things like that, that are in the picture. The reality is it's not enough. We need something that is more dedicated for climate-induced loss and damage because it's happening now and it's going to get worse. Climate-induced migration is a big topic that we're not quite addressing yet in a reasonable way internationally. 80% of the people who are displaced by climate change are women, so there's another disproportionate impact for a vulnerable group. So the loss and damage finance conversation is what's the highlight of the COP right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and in part, this loss and damage conversation is a conversation about responsibility.
Exactly.
Right, and other language that's being used is language of reparations. So, Mubashir, if I could turn to you, if you can pick up on these themes.
Yeah, I think it's one of the ways in which we can actually really go back and look at how development and underdevelopment has happened in the post-colonial world, and what is the relationship of, let's say, the legacy of irrigation projects that started in the 1840s, 1850s, under British colonial rule. So for people who are attention to like economic histories or histories of development, many of the countries that found independence or some form of independence in the 1940s were starting with below zero because of the way in which they were already tapped into a colonial economy systems. It has been estimated that the British Raj in South Asia extracted up to 75 trillion by Prabhat Patnaik in the 200 years of colonial rule, negative GDP growth in that time of 100, 200 years ago. So you have economy that was perhaps 20-25% of the world economy to be negligible, less than 2% or less in terms of exporting textiles to becoming exporting just cotton by 1947. The one way in which the economic development paradigm was to borrow from World Bank and then IMF in that particular way. And one of the things is that has kind of deepened a set of conditionalities on many vulnerable countries, smaller economies, particularly on what they can and cannot do with the finances or what they can finance. So this is a kind of opportunity to like really open up a larger conversation because it is about global survival and how do extractive economies actually have kind of created the conditions for the kind of uneven world that is threatening all of us, whether it's forced migration. So the loss and damage could be looked at in a very large way in that sense, but it could be also very much about mitigating immediate harm, about addressing the kind of issues that are happening and unfolding as they are in Nigeria and in Pakistan this summer, where the countries that are already burdened with extreme amounts of debt and IMF and World Bank conditionalities can find some kind of relief to start mitigating and rebuilding their economies with a social safety net. One of the things that is also interesting about, let's say, the role of IFIs, international finance institutions, is that they're playing a very dodgy game at times of moving along and signing off on ban of fossil fuel, like which started happening with banning of coal in the last. But World Bank's private bank is still indirectly subsidizing coal mining in places like Pakistan. The way that happens is adding some sort of taxation on, let's say, solar panels. So countries are forced to subsidize coal mining in particular. So making credit available to certain kind of extractive resources rather and taxing other alternative pathways. So that's another thing that is really central to going back to the previous panel of how to move away from fossil fuels in the development paradigm, and that be central to loss and damage into mitigating harm from fossil fuel emissions.
So we've moved rapidly from a conversation about community-level vulnerabilities in the face of climate change to the structuring of the global economy. So Melanie, can you tie a bow on this for us? Help us make sense of this tangle of concepts.
You know, not to be cynical, but to be cynical. The COP, the Conference of Parties, which is essentially a big theatrical performance, reminds me of that American movie, The Groundhog Day. You know, have you guys seen it? You guys have seen it, right? Yeah. So,
yes.
So basically what happens is, you know, he's caught in this loop of things that just repeat itself. And he gets up every morning hoping that it's going to be new, but actually it just repeats itself, right? And so in many ways, the major economic sort of decision-making and kind of deadlock that we're seeing at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh is that the wealthiest and most powerful countries in the world do not want to commit to anything that looks like liability, that looks like the admission of guilt, right? That looks like they'll be on the hook for what they think of as a bottomless pit of asks from the climate vulnerable world, right, as far as this loss and damage goes. And so in many ways, it is old wine in new bottle as far as the language of loss and damage goes, although, as you were rightly saying, we've seen this for at least 10 to 15 years on the agenda. It's just that it's now become officially recognized at the Paris COP as one of the 3 pillars of global climate policy. So you know, the major issue really is this deadlock as far as the wealthiest countries saying we don't want to kind of commit to this, right? Because we're scared that this is going to be sort of this slippery slide to like endless finance being demanded. And so I think, you know, that's really important to recognize. So on Monday, you might have seen in the news that the V20, which is a group of the 58 finance ministers of some of the most vulnerable countries in the world, together with the G7, which we all know is the most powerful countries in the world, got together to propose a global climate shield, which is supposed to be the sort of stopgap or solution or the compromise solution. It's an insurance fund, essentially. And so it's very, very specific funding for, you know, for particular disaster-related damage. And, you know, the social justice activists, climate justice activists say, look, insurance financing, basically propping up the insurance companies of the world, is not what we're asking for here. You know, let me just put in perspective the fact that during the pandemic, the 10 richest men in the world, right, doubled their collective wealth of $700 billion. During the pandemic, right? We're talking about 2.5 years, they doubled their wealth. And so while other people, the majority, were losing jobs, were losing lives, were losing, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in a very deeply unequal world where there's vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And so this is why loss and damage financing has reached a kind of dead end, and we're proposing insurance as a market-based financing mechanism instead.
Niranjali, is there a way through this deadlock?
Oh, the truth is I don't know. I mean, unless there is enough political will from the developed world to put this money on the table, and maybe that pressure has to come from the citizens of those countries saying enough is enough. We don't want our counterparts in the rest of the world to suffer, to die, because we're looking at an extinction level event here, right? It's a slow onset extinction is what we are signing up for by not providing the finance that's needed. So maybe the solution to some degree rests with people power and holding governments to account. And we just have to keep pushing the decision makers and the elites and take power back. Easier said than done, but it's in those moments that I've seen developed countries take some steps. You mentioned the V20. I also wanted to mention the Bridgetown agenda that was put forward or led by the Prime Minister of Barbados, which is also trying to tackle some of these big macroeconomic issues. And you know, to say, look, there's this thing called an SDR, the special drawing rights that are issued as a way of essentially allowing for the creation of money. And they're saying, look, if you're going to create this and have most of that money go to the developed world in the first place, then to rechannel that to us so that we can use that for loss and damage. We can use that for climate adaptation, give that to the vulnerable world. These are simple solutions, really. That have become overcomplicated because of the kinds of financial hurdles and barriers that have been put in place by treasuries and parliaments in the developed world to protect their power. So we really have to, I think, as people, recognize that the financial system does not work for us. The way we measure growth through GDP, which is based on overconsumption, perhaps even the concept of growth, is something we need to rethink dramatically if we want to have a livable planet.
We have just a couple of minutes left. Mubashir, can I turn back to you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree. And I think one of the things that really, just to go back to some of the previous panels and what we've heard today, it is about communication, and it is a lot about how do we think about what's happening and how to connect what's happening, let's say in Pakistan, Nigeria, to what's happening here, because I think that is one of the ways in which we have been able to kind of bracket off or siphon off ourselves from impending doom that's happening all over the world, is by thinking about it in various different logics that we have inherited, rather than thinking about it as extinction level events that are happening for all of us. There's so much we take for granted that, you know, the earth provides food for us, right? What if that's not a guarantee for our, you know, our descendants 2 generations down? How scary is that, no matter where you live, right? So I think one place of hope or space of hope I have is that there is a growing movement for kind of global climate action that's happening, and loss and damage did not become a third pillar in all these negotiations without a lot of civil society and activist organizations clamoring and asking for it. So I feel like there is a lot of momentum to hold large economies and corporations accountable, and it's great to hear even like the UN kind of really getting involved in all of this in terms of like what would be 10-15 years ago very radical asks of ending fossil fuel subsidies is now something that even middle school kids might understand in that sense, right? With the help of a dinosaur. So I think that those are the right strategies, and I think we really need to kind of think about it in a kind of planetary way. The obstacle to that has been histories of empire and race, and you know how we think of ourselves as being cushioned or benefiting from systems that might actually lead to our own collective, as you said, extinction. So I think thinking in those terms, larger terms, historical terms, planetary terms will help.
Thank you. Ooh, Niranjali from ActionAid USA, thank you for being here today. My colleagues from American University, Malini, Mubashir, thank you both for your comments. We turn now to the final remarks. Charlotte.
Thank you so much. Folks, let's give it a hand for our panel once again. What a day. That was absolutely phenomenal. What an incredible lineup of speakers we've had today. I told you all earlier this morning that I used to be quite intimidated by the climate change conversation because it's big, it's overwhelming. You know, there's doom and gloom around every corner when it comes to this topic. And what's wonderful about today is that we get to see all these inspirational and motivational folks give us reasons to hope, to fight back, to be motivated. And I'm just incredibly grateful for them, for We Don't Have Time, for American University. This has been a wonderful event today. Simon, I believe we hit 600,000 live viewers. Isn't that true? Yeah, 600,000 live viewers, over 500,000 live viewers today at this event. So thank you all for showing up in person to see this. We really appreciate it. With that, I am going to bring up back Dean Hayter to give our closing remarks. So please give it up for Dean Hayter.
Well, thank you, everyone. I am a substitute. Some of you might have known that our President Sylvia Burwell was going to be here with us to give their closing remarks. She's a little bit under the weather, and given our dedication to public health and COVID precautions, we said, don't come. and she's very much on board of that. So I have the pleasure of both thanking you all, but also sharing some of her thanks for the broader American University. We are so excited for everybody who's been here in the room. Some people have been here for all 3 hours. We're super excited for everybody who has tuned in from around the world. And we're just grateful to be part of these important discussions. Special thanks to Dr. Tom Snitch, our AU Eagle, who brought this event and this partnership to AU's campus. Special thanks to the whole We Don't Have Time team and all of our expert speakers today. Special thanks to my events team, Kay and Kate and others who helped us partner and pull it off. And, you know, just I think a few thoughts. You know, several speakers today have highlighted that we must act now to address the vulnerabilities that are made worse by climate change, both on a human level, but also on an infrastructure level. We at American University try to live our values, and we're not afraid to take bold steps when necessary to be a place where just sustainable future doesn't seem so far away. In 2018, and I learned this when I was looking to come to AU, AU became the first university in the US to become a carbon neutral university. And we achieved that goal 2 years early. So it shows if you make big, bold commitments, you can actually accelerate the pace and even beat your own expectations and ideals. Today here at AU, we use 100% renewable electricity on campus, which comes from a mixture of on and off-campus solar and renewable energy credits. And we boast of 10 LEED certified buildings, including the building we are in right now, as well as biodiesel buses. Now, we're also home to game-changing scholarship for climate justice and for related aspects of justice. You know, one thing that I think particularly President Burwell feels very passionate about is sort of the related area of food justice as well, right? Without climate justice, you also don't get food justice. If we think about growth in arable lands and land distribution and droughts and crises and hurricanes and floods and access. And she has stated before, and I'll share for her, you know, she believes that building an equitable and just food system is complementary to our crisis race, and it is crucial to our future as a nation, as a planet. She quotes President Obama, who once said, it's a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative, and it's a security imperative. And I mention that because we have here at AU received a $15 million National Science Foundation grant led by Professor Siddiqui, which focuses on this problem of wasted food here in the U.S., but also it's an on-ramp to our broader global engagements on food justice. In March, we will be hosting a summit on food justice more broadly to be held at one of our properties, a pretty new properties, Airlie Farm in Virginia. It's a AU-owned farm that's tucked into some rolling hills out by Warrenton. And a little known fact about it is the first convening that created Earth Day happened there. So today, Airlie's a working farm growing thousands of pounds of vegetables to help feed college students across the Washington, D.C. area. And we hope to connect that history, that site, and that commitment of shared commitments to progress on climate and food justice. As hopefully you've seen a little bit of flavor of today, our world-class faculty lead incredible educational programs and centers focused on environmental sustainability, including our master's programs for sustainable management, our Center for Environmental Policies, our Center for Environment and Community and Equity, our Center for Environmental Filmmaking, our Center for Environmental Sciences. So there's a lot going on. And today's Climate Hub, co-sponsored by all the partners we just mentioned, CC, We Don't Have Time, SIS, I think is just an exciting way to share our dedication and build those partnerships out more. And I think what I've been able to discover in my short time here so far is that AU's sustainable leadership is really student-driven. Our students are passionate advocates for sustainability, and through our community garden, our beekeeping society, our student zero waste club, and much, much more, our students work to ensure that AU continues to strive to be a model for sustainable practices. And that's really what building a sustainable future is all about. So thank you for being here today. Thankful for you for watching from Egypt and from around the world. And we wish all of us well in terms of what comes out of the final hours of negotiations and the COP activities. And thank you, especially looking around to our host. Where's our host? Where did she go? Well, join me in thanking our host with one last round of applause, because she's been amazing. And so I think with that, we're out, right? All right. Thank you all.